Chapter 91 Battlefield 1. Asterion and Arcturus chose the battlefield in a field not far from Scotland, not only to minimize damage but also to distance themselves from Diagon Alley. It would be foolish to fight in the economic center of the British Wizarding Society. The Civil War had become complicated, especially with Germany and France secretly sending money and people to work alongside Voldemort. To anyone else, these witches and wizards from other countries were nothing more than Voldemort's sympathizers who joined the dark side to create an extremist society. But everyone involved knew that these witches and wizards were nothing more than agents sent by both countries to make the situation even more chaotic and filled with deaths. On top of a hill not far from the battlefield, Asterion sat in a chair, staring at the hill miles away. On that hill, he could sense Voldemort's magical aura, but neither Asterion nor Voldemort had moved. It seems he has learned his lesson. Seeing Voldemort had not moved to join the battle, Asterion murmured to himself. Pawns fight pawns and kings fight kings. This phrase holds especially true in this world, where wizards have a huge disparity in levels of power. Grade 3 wizards fight Grade 3 wizards, and so on. This was an implicit tacit agreement among all those participating in this war. 13 years ago, Voldemort ignored this and went to the Potter house, fearing a mere baby, where he ended up dying due to a simple mistake and a mother's love. Asterion could feel the man's gaze on him but selectively ignored it. He watched the battlefield with a calm gaze. The quality of wizards between the Clock Tower and the Death Eaters was nearly equal, especially with the elites of both countries, Germany and France, participating in this civil war. The ministers of both countries did not hesitate to use their elites in this conflict. This turned a quick battle he planned with his allies into a war of attrition. Asterion could have quickly ended the war by killing Voldemort, but he chose not to. The reason was very simple: this war was beneficial to him. The longer the war lasted, the more he could extend his influence over the Clock Tower. This was also Dumbledore's thought. The longer the war dragged on, the more the pure-blood faction would be weakened. So, whether it was Asterion or Dumbledore, both wanted this war to continue for a while longer. Midline horizontal ellipsis. The gigantic plasma beam tore through the earth, sending shockwaves around. Bellatrix dodged a piercing spell and smiled gleefully. With a flick of her wrist, she moved her arm in a half-moon arc, and her wand released a burst of flames towards her opponent. Her black hair billowed through the orange flames. The opponent cast a protego, and using the time the shield bought him, he apparat to a safe distance, breathing heavily. Sweat trickled down the man's face as his brown eyes remained fixed on the woman in front of him. "Don't look at me like that, I'll feel flattered," Bellatrix said in a somewhat coy tone, in response to the man's intense gaze. Suddenly, Bellatrix's expression changed. Her hairs stood on end, alerting her to danger. Without hesitation, she leaned back and watched as a blade sliced past her throat, leaving a trail of blood behind. Operating to maintain distance, Bellatrix observed the tall young man with black hair and blue eyes, staring at her with a particularly deadly and cold gaze. "That was dangerous, I didn't sense you," she said with a delighted look. Born with an extraordinary perception due to her simplified innate technique, she could sense anything magical within 100 meters. But she couldn't sense the young man in front of her. Her eyes could see him, but her senses told her no one was there. "Come to think of it, you look familiar." Looking at the young man's face, Bellatrix placed a finger on her lips and showed a cute and innocent expression, seemingly talking to herself. Then, her smile twisted into a sadistic and cruel grin. "By any chance, did I kill one of your relatives?" Neville clenched his fists and looked coldly at the torturer of his parents. His alchemical items, 2 daggers, spun deftly in his hands as he approached. Bellatrix smiled and recognized that look. It was the same look countless people had given her over the years, a look of hatred and repressed fury. Using her index finger to touch the blood on her neck, Bellatrix licked her own blood and smiled happily. "It's been a while since I've seen my own blood," she said cheerfully, unconcerned with the young man's approach. Neville advanced, his grip on the daggers tightening. He felt the same look he had faced when confronting Asterion, the deeply rooted disdain in his opponent's eyes. Contracting the muscles in his legs tightly, Neville stomped on the ground and disappeared from his spot, leaving the ground beneath him sunken. He reappeared in front of Bellatrix, his daggers slicing through the air towards her head and heart. With a broad smile on her lips, Bellatrix stepped back and dodged the attacks. In the next moment, she spun and kicked Neville's head with a swift and powerful kick charged with magical energy. Neville didn't dodge the kick, he grabbed her leg despite the impact that reverberated through his body. With his other hand, his dagger moved like a serpent writhing in the air. Bellatrix waved her hand, and a curtain of black smoke appeared in her palm. From it emerged a small bird. As the bird appeared, a strong gust of wind sent Neville's body flying backward, spinning in different directions. "You are physically strong, with extraordinary senses. Unfortunately, you have no magic," Bellatrix said as she looked at her dislocated wrist. She grabbed her left wrist and twisted it forcefully, setting the bones back in place. "You must be Frank and Alice's son," she said with a nostalgic smile. "We studied together at Hogwarts." Narrowing her eyes, she watched Neville get up without any injuries and spoke with a cheerful and sadistic tone. It was beautiful to hear her screams, begging for death. Neville, hearing this, spoke each word through clenched teeth. "You are a monster. How can you torture people like that and smile afterward?" Tilting her head to the side and showing a genuinely confused expression, she asked as if hearing a stupid question. "Isn't it obvious?" "Because it's fun," she finished with an innocent smile on her lips. "Monster, you are a monster, even more cursed than Asterion Black," Neville said coldly, assuming a fighting stance, a tender and youthful killing intent radiating around him. "What hypocrisy! Do you realize you are fighting for the will of the sweet and lovely master?" Bellatrix spread her arms and spoke, dissatisfied with his words, more specifically, dissatisfied with his slander of Asterion. "He will die too when I kill you." Neville remained indifferent to Bellatrix's words. Hearing this, the smile on Bellatrix's face vanished completely. Behind her, numerous curtains of smoke unfolded. "How dare you threaten my master, you filthy half-blood! I'll kill you like one crushes an insect, you aborted wretch!" Raising her head, Bellatrix's beautiful face twisted with anger and fury. Chapter 92 Battlefield 2. Hundreds of cursed spirits, each more grotesque than the last, emerged from the smoke curtains emitting repugnant sounds. "Die!" With a wave of her hand, Bellatrix commanded all the cursed spirits to focus entirely on Neville, thousands of eyes staring fixedly at him. Neville couldn't see the cursed spirits, but he could feel them perfectly. He couldn't help but curl his lips. Bellatrix was furious, and that made him happy for the first time in many years. Tightening his grip on his daggers, which had the ability to cut through magical energy and negative magical energy, Neville didn't falter in the face of the horde of cursed spirits he could sense. On the contrary, he advanced toward Bellatrix, surrounded by cursed spirits. A massive centipede lunged forward, its hundreds of legs pounding against the ground as its open mouth drooled corrosive saliva. Neville spun his dagger in his hand and landed it on the centipede's carapace. Without hesitation, he plunged the dagger into the carapace and charged forward, tearing through the centipede's entire torso. Blood splattered everywhere. Before the cursed spirit could regenerate, Neville spun in the air and stomped with his extreme force on the centipede's head, causing it to explode and scatter blood and organs across the ground. He didn't stop, continuing to advance toward the next cursed spirit, plunging his daggers into cursed spirits while dodging numerous other attacks. With a cold smile, Bellatrix snapped her fingers, sacrificing one of the cursed spirits, causing it to explode near Neville. Neville didn't even have a chance to react before he was engulfed by the explosion of the cursed spirit. When the explosion subsided, Neville's figure was revealed. Red blood fell onto the earth. Neville, with a large portion of his body burned, breathed heavily as blood trickled from his forehead and left arm. His blue eyes fixed on the woman with black hair. "Is it hurting? If it is, I can wait for you to rest a bit, filthy abortion." Sitting on a grotesque worm, Bellatrix crossed her legs and asked with a cold smile. "Think of it as my mercy for Alice's son." Neville took a deep breath. Every word that came out of that woman's filthy mouth made him furious. He found Asterion Black irritating, but he discovered that Bellatrix was even more unbearable. At this moment, he just wanted to shove his daggers into that woman's mouth and rip her tongue out. The descendant of the Longbottom house calmed himself and focused on the moment. He needed to be quick, quicker than ever before. Any cursed spirit could explode and kill him on the spot. Neville tensed all the muscles in his body, hardening them like never before. The blood flow in his body began to accelerate, and his heartbeat increased. Feeling his body burning from within, Neville opened his mouth and exhaled a hot, scalding breath. In the next moment, he took a step forward. The world blurred in Neville's eyes, making it difficult to see anything clearly, even with his extraordinary senses. Nevertheless, his eyes never left Bellatrix. At that moment, Neville Longbottom's speed reached an incredible 10 times the speed of sound. Perhaps in the entire history of the wizarding world, he was the only one to achieve such abysmal speeds without using a single drop of magical energy. Sheesh, it was like an arrow tearing through everything in its path, cursed spirits or not. Any cursed spirit was cut in half in the blink of an eye. A large amount of purple and green blood spread across hundreds of meters. Neville arrived in front of her, his dagger pointed directly at Bellatrix's throat. "Die!" Neville shouted angrily, ignoring the muscles torn apart by the exorbitant speed he had reached. Bellatrix didn't even have time to react before her throat was stabbed. Even with her throat impaled, Bellatrix unconsciously moved her hand and reached for Neville's abdomen. Bellatrix's world seemed to slow down, her body, mind, and soul seemed clearer than ever before. In that instant, she managed to achieve what many wizards would never accomplish in their lifetimes. She cast a spell without a wand. Maxima Bombarda. As the wandless and incantationless spell was cast, magical energy tore through reality, making the impossible possible. A fleeting glow appeared in her palm, and a ball of blue energy tore through Neville's skin, exploding organs and bones. Boom! Both were thrown backward by the explosion. A large amount of blood flowed from Bellatrix's throat, but she showed no fear or remorse. On the contrary, she let out a lively, fun-filled laugh. Her clothes were almost all blown off, revealing a large portion of her nudity and severe burns on certain parts of her body. Neville was in an even worse condition. In addition to the severe burns covering his body, half of his right abdomen was missing, leaving a huge hole where his stomach used to be. A large amount of blood flowed from the mortal wound. 2 loud snaps, similar to car exhausts, sounded on their battlefield. An old man wearing a blue robe and a long white beard pointed directly at the fallen Bellatrix while checking Neville Longbottom's condition. Beside Bellatrix, a teenager appeared, looking coldly at Dumbledore. Asterion looked at Bellatrix's deplorable state, the pentagram in his eyes revealing a gleam. A hologram of Bellatrix's body appeared in his mind, with at least 100 areas highlighted in red, indicating some kind of injury. Over 100 broken bones, severely damaged organs, and a gaping wound in the carotid artery. Knowing his cousin's injuries, he grabbed a very expensive potion, made by Nicholas Flamel himself. He opened the potion and poured the liquid onto her neck wound, which was the most severe of her injuries. A large amount of white smoke was emitted as the liquid came into contact with the blood and the wound. Unconcerned with Dumbledore and the wretched abortion that was dead in his eyes, Asterion took the still-conscious Bellatrix in his arms, his touch as gentle as possible, afraid of worsening her injuries. Cough! Bellatrix coughed violently and looked affectionately at Asterion, speaking in a hoarse, trembling voice. "My Prince Charming came to rescue me." Asterion rolled his eyes. He didn't expect Bellatrix to still be able to joke in such a serious situation. "Look at your condition, you almost died," Asterion reproached his cousin as he hugged her slightly tighter. "You should have seen that filthy abortion," Bellatrix replied, unbothered by being reprimanded, her tone weak and tired. No longer wanting to speak to this madwoman, Asterion operated away, leaving Dumbledore to try to save Neville's life. Chapter 93, Conflicts on the Battlefield. 1. Placing Bellatrix gently on the bed, Asterion sat beside her and gently moved the black hair that was covering her face to the side, looking directly into her green eyes. His red eyes staring directly into hers. "What? Want to make love?" Even with hundreds of broken bones and severely injured, Bellatrix asked with an ambiguous smile on her lips. She licked her dry lips with dried blood, looking at him with growing anticipation in her eyes. Asterion rolled his eyes and replied in a calm and serene tone. "What happened that night won't happen again, Bella. I won't betray my future wife again." Bellatrix pouted and spoke with a voice full of dissatisfaction. "That didn't stop you from sleeping with me the other time." Stroking her cheek, Asterion responded with the same even tone. "I was shaken by the news of Arcturus's death." Honestly, after sleeping with Bellatrix, Asterion felt a bit unworthy of Daphne. He hated betrayal and did what he hated the most, betraying someone who had given him their full trust. He regretted betraying Daphne, even if it was at such a delicate moment when he received the news that he would have to kill Arcturus. "That makes you better than my ex-husband," Bellatrix murmured to herself, noticing the look in his eyes. Taking Lucius out of the equation, "Anyone is better than your husband," Asterion laughed and replied with a slight tone of amusement. Bellatrix also laughed at the joke and replied with another joke, or if it could be called a joke in the first place. "I would have killed the mistresses and cooked them and made him eat them. It would have been hilarious to see his expression when I told him what he ate." Asterion pursed his lips hearing that. Bellatrix's sense of humor was as bizarrely bizarre as before. Letting out a tired sigh, Asterion spoke with a helpless tone. "Please, refrain from making people cannibals, this world is dirty enough." "Yes, master," Bellatrix replied with a serious look, then smiled innocently like a child asking for permission to buy a toy they saw. "But can I continue to kill?" "Yes, but only enemies," Asterion nodded and continued with an extremely serious expression. "When you're moderately healed, return to Voldemort's camp and start the plan." Bellatrix's smile stretched from ear to ear, a creepy smile full of sadistic feeling. "Time to start the game," she whispered to herself with an excited look. Seeing Bellatrix excited, Asterion shook his head and called Narcissa through the cursed spirit he had placed to protect her. The doors of the room were almost immediately opened, and Narcissa entered with a worried look. Looking at her sister so severely injured in bed, Narcissa's heart almost burst in her chest. Who hurt her? Narcissa asked, her tone tinged with a coldness capable of freezing the Arctic again. Frank and Alice's son. He was quite strong for a magicless abortion, Bellatrix replied excitedly, ignoring the atmosphere hovering in the room. But you should see the state I left him in. Dumbledore is probably burying him at this exact moment. Bellatrix smiled brightly, recalling the maximum bombarda that destroyed the organs of the filthy abortion. Giving Bella a kiss on the cheek, Asterion got up from the bed, walked over to Narcissa, and also gave her a kiss on the cheek. Sissy, don't fully heal Bella, I'll be returning to the battlefield. Narcissa nodded and watched as he disapparated out of the room. You seem like a child, always causing more and more trouble. Looking at her sister in bed, Narcissa sighed as she sat beside her. I was under orders from my master, Bellatrix retorted, very dissatisfied with being called a child. I know you, Bellatrix Black, Narcissa rolled her eyes at her sister. You just want to cause more chaos and destruction, it's always been like that since you were little. Bellatrix pouted hearing this, but didn't deny her words. It wasn't exactly a lie. Fortunately, her master knew she didn't like boring missions and always ordered her to the most fun missions, like being a double agent or starting a beautiful massacre to start a good day. I'll get the potions, how much do you want to heal? Narcissa asked, frowning as she looked at Bellatrix's wounds, especially the large burns on her skin. If Bellatrix were a muggle, she would have to live marked with these burns for her entire life. Fortunately, nothing that a potion couldn't fix. Leave the burns and some dozen broken bones, Bellatrix replied indifferently, as if she didn't care at all about her own injuries. Narcissa nodded, kissed Bella's cheek affectionately, and got off the bed, walking towards the door. She stopped and turned to look at Bellatrix with a serious look. Don't die, Bella. I don't want to bury another relative. You don't need to worry about me, Miss Perfect Lady. You should be worrying about my enemies. They will suffer while I kill them one by one, all to fulfill the orders of my lovely master. Bellatrix flashed a smirk and replied with an increasingly excited voice. Narcissa let out a tired sigh upon hearing this. Take care of yourself, Bella. With that said, she left the room. Bellatrix silently watched Narcissa's back and then turned her gaze to the ceiling, where she pondered many things before closing her eyes to rest for a while. Battlefield Clock Tower Camp. As Asterion returned to the camp, successive explosions reverberated in the sky accompanied by strong tremors. They were level 1 wizards officially appearing on the battlefield. Lord Black. Asterion turned and looked at his future father-in-law, Aurelius Greengrass. As he had imagined earlier, with the support of the neutral faction, Aurelius had currently become one of the 12 lords of the clock tower, the lord of the Department of Botany. Lord Greengrass. The black heir greeted him back with some respect in his tone, after all, he was his father-in-law. But even though he tried to respect the man, Asterion wasn't someone who flattered people, it was quite the opposite, people flattered him. Asterion began to walk and gestured for Aurelius to walk beside him. With the entry of level 1 wizards into the battlefield, we are gradually gaining the advantage, the Death Eaters are increasingly cornered. We estimate that the Dark Lord's forces won't hold out for much longer. Arriving by his future son-in-law's side, Aurelius began to explain the current situation of the battlefield. You don't need to worry about Voldemort entering the battlefield, the man absolutely won't initiate a direct confrontation with me and Albus Dumbledore present in the camp, Asterion spoke, after a brief silence, but as he was about to finish his sentence, he was interrupted by a gigantic needle coming towards him. But before the nearly 30-meter-long needle could approach Asterion, Aurelius beside him simply created a gigantic chain of wind, changing the trajectory of the huge needle, causing it to collide with the ground. When the needle collided with the ground, it created a huge crater accompanied by a thunderous sound that echoed throughout the camp. A cloud of dust spread to the sides. Naturally, all this commotion caught the attention of countless people in the camp. "What is the meaning of this, Matriarch Longbottom?" Aurelius asked with a voice full of authority mixed with a touch of anger. Anyone would be furious to be attacked so suddenly, and Aurelius was no different from anyone else in this aspect. He looked at the old lady, her eyes red from crying so much, with a confused look. He didn't understand why Lady Matriarch Longbottom had attacked. Augusta didn't even bother to look at Aurelius, her swollen and almost crazed eyes were fixed on Asterion. In that gaze, fury, resentment, hatred, and malice mingled, creating a look that sent a chill down Aurelius's spine as he stood beside her, facing that gaze. What would someone need to feel to demonstrate such a look? Aurelius didn't know, and he didn't need to know. He wanted his sanity intact for a long time. "You monster, your cursed family, my dear Neville," Augusta murmured, looking at Asterion. She bit her own lips so hard that blood stained her lips. She raised her wand and pointed with her trembling hand. "Augusta." Before the matriarch could start her attack again, a small figure appeared beside her and unexpectedly snatched the wand from Matriarch Longbottom's hand. Asterion looked at Professor Flitwick with a surprised look. He thought the man was dead, as he hadn't seen him for months after the attack on Hogwarts. But seeing the half-goblin alive and well in front of him, it was obvious that Phileas Flitwick had survived Voldemort, which was a great achievement. However, looking at Professor Flitwick's empty left shirt sleeve, it was obvious that a price had been paid for him to survive an attack by a level special wizard. Which was an insignificant price compared to life itself. Turning his gaze back to Augusta Longbottom, looking at her state of hysteria, Asterion wondered, had Neville Longbottom died? Chapter 94, Conflicts on the Battlefield, 2, more and more people began to gather around, all looking at Asterion and Augusta with curious looks. Asterion presumed that Neville had indeed died from Augusta's reaction. This made him feel mixed emotions, of regret and sadness to be more exact. He felt regret for not killing Neville earlier, and how he would have liked to have Neville on his dissection table. As for sadness, he felt sad for not seeing Neville's reaction when he destroyed the Longbottom house. "Although I don't know the reason behind this attack, you have to face consequences, especially for attacking your commander." Casually dusting off his shoulders due to the attack, Asterion spoke calmly, his red eyes staring directly into the eyes of Matriarch Longbottom. A tense atmosphere spread among all those who were watching. No one spoke against Asterion's words, not because he was the strongest, but because he was right. There is no army in the world where a soldier can try to kill his commander and walk away without consequences. Lord Black. Seeing things getting increasingly tense, Phileas intervened before things got even worse. Asterion looked at his professor and nodded in greeting. "It pleases me to see you alive, Professor Flitwick. I appreciate your words, but please, do not punish Lady Augusta severely. She is suffering from the condition of her grandson, who is on the verge of death because of his fight with Bellatrix Lestrange." Phileas spoke with a serious tone and looked at his brightest student with an almost pleading look. Phileas himself knew that it was impossible for Augusta to get out of this situation without consequences. After all, if such a thing were not punished, it would set a very wrong example to all the soldiers on the battlefield, who could break the rules and not suffer the proper consequences. Listening to the words of the half-goblin, everyone around understood the root of the conflict. They looked at Augusta with pity, but no one spoke up to help her. After all, instead of attacking Bellatrix herself, Augusta attacked their commander. Asterion had quite a bit of prestige in the army. Just his presence on the battlefield made everyone feel safer because with Asterion present, Voldemort wouldn't attack the weaker soldiers on the battlefield. So everyone had a lot of respect for the 13-year-old. With Filius's words, Asterion himself knew that Neville was alive, although still in critical condition. Remembering the grave state Bellatrix left Neville in, the Black Heir felt it was a miracle Neville was still alive. Dumbledore must have paid a hefty price to keep the young man alive, despite Neville having half of his organs due to Bellatrix's maximum bombarda. Looking at Filius and then at the people around, Asterion pondered. Everyone could hear Filius's words, so if he were too harsh with the punishment, it would affect his image. Something he didn't want, especially after gaining so much prestige and gradually clearing the infamy of the Black House. Lady Augusta will have to go to the battlefield and prove her worth. If she refuses the assigned task, she will have to face the tribunal with serious consequences for attacking the acting commander. Asterion spoke, after a brief silence, delivering the verdict. It wasn't a very severe punishment, but due to Augusta's advanced age, it was a particularly dangerous punishment. When everyone heard, no one found it excessive, although Lady Longbottom's advanced age was a particularly serious issue, nothing that reinforcement magic couldn't help with. Filius also relaxed with the words. In his mind, he was already prepared to hear Augusta's death sentence, but any reduction in punishment was a victory in his eyes. Throughout the process, Augusta Longbottom never took her eyes off Asterion's figure, as if she wanted to engrave his image in the depths of her mind, so she would never forget him. Asterion didn't care about her gaze, he wanted her to remember him, as he would be the last face she would see before death came to reap her soul. That he would ensure happened with much pain and sadism. "Good job, Aurelius," who had been beside Asterion the whole time, murmured with a look of satisfaction on his face. His son-in-law did an excellent job with Augusta, not letting anger cloud his judgment. Although severely punishing Augusta would have a better impact on the pure-blood faction, it would bring a certain infamy to Asterion. Even if small, it was such things that made people not trust you. A stern and fair image was much more well received than a cold and emotionless commander, which would greatly help his son-in-law's future and consequently Daphne's. "Let's start pressing the battlefield, Lord Greengrass. If we continue in this stalemate, morale may begin to decline, especially when there is no significant victory." Asterion, walking towards the main tent of the camp, spoke to the man beside him. Aurelius nodded. Asterion was right, this war had been going on for almost a month, during which time seeing the death of comrades had brought a tense and heavy atmosphere to the entire camp. They had to achieve a significant victory to boost army morale, otherwise, victory would be an uncertain factor in the future. "I will speak with Dumbledore so that the semi-special grade wizards can enter the battlefield," Aurelius replied with a serious look. The pure-blood faction didn't have many semi-special grade wizards compared to the light faction. The pure-blood faction was only more powerful because of Arcturus, who was worth 3 or 4 semi-special grade wizards with his cursed spirits. In comparison, Dumbledore could mobilize at least 4 semi-special grade wizards like Minerva McGonagall, Filius Flitwick, Aberforth Dumbledore, and Alastair Moody, all prestigious wizards and witches in the British community. Asterion nodded at his words and entered the tent. Inside, the space had been expanded with an expansion spell, making the interior of the tent as large as a mansion. Inside, almost all the wizards and witches working in logistics were working with a serious and concentrated look. In the center of the tent was a rectangular table with dozens of chairs. Of these dozens of chairs, at least half were occupied. 2 main chairs were at the end of the table, and in one of them, Albus Dumbledore was sitting, calmly sipping tea. Seeing Asterion sitting beside him, he spoke with a curious look. It was very noisy outside. Asterion rolled his eyes at the man's acting. It was obviously his fault, but he was acting all curious as if he didn't know anything. A truly hypocritical man, that was Albus Dumbledore. A grandmother saddened by the critical condition of her grandson, Asterion replied calmly, looking directly into the eyes of the Hogwarts headmaster. A pity what happened to young Neville. Bellatrix Lestrange was extremely cruel and insidious. Dumbledore sighed sadly, his voice low and full of sorrow for Neville's cruel fate. Asterion again rolled his eyes at the man's shameless words. Neville had been even crueler to Bellatrix, not only breaking hundreds of bones but also stabbing a dagger into his cousin and subordinate's neck. If he hadn't arrived in time and used a rare healing potion made from phoenix tears, Bellatrix would be dead by now. Will he survive? Asterion asked after a brief silence. His gaze showed curiosity about Neville's condition. He didn't believe Dumbledore's words at all. The man owned a phoenix. It could be said that as long as you had a phoenix, you were practically immortal. Yes, but with serious sequelae. Dumbledore nodded with a serious and sorrowful expression. Asterion internally scoffed at his words but remained silent. He turned his gaze to everyone sitting at the table and spoke calmly. Let's begin the strategic meeting. Chapter 95. The war intensifies. 1. The atmosphere of the war had not spread throughout Great Britain. The clock tower had controlled the course of the war to prevent it from spreading too far, so almost all of England seemed unaffected by this civil war. Well, partly because Voldemort was losing and did not want to divide his already scarce troops. Hogwarts. Rose, wait for me. Hermione quickly caught up with Rose, carrying a second-year spellbook in her arms. Don't be slow, Hermione. Let's get to the library, Rose said without looking at her friend, continuing toward the library with hurried steps. She was swamped with homework due to her private lessons with Dumbledore. The man was not going easy on her, especially with the tons of homework he was giving her. Honestly, if she didn't have the 6 eyes and the ability to process information extremely quickly, she wouldn't be able to keep up with Dumbledore's insane teaching pace. Sometimes Rose thought Dumbledore was in a hurry to teach her as quickly as possible, as if he might die at any moment. Upon arriving at the library, Rose and Hermione found Ron studying. This made both girls think they were under some illusion spell. Ron Weasley studying in the library. This would certainly be surprising news that would spread throughout Hogwarts. Rose no longer felt the animosity toward the boy she had at the beginning of the school year. She saw that although Ron was somewhat tactless about certain matters, he was a decent boy with a good heart. Hermione, on the other hand, upon seeing the boy, snorted coldly, glaring at the redhead. Throughout her time at Hogwarts, Ron was the person she argued with the most. Besides being insulted with nicknames like Bookworm and other degrading names, she was insulted only for wanting to help the boy speak some spells correctly. After that, Hermione and Ron were officially mortal enemies. They didn't like each other and didn't hide their animosity. Rose just laughed at her friend's reaction. She knew Hermione didn't like the boy, so she didn't greet him despite his obvious attempt to approach her. Despite her wishes, as soon as they sat down at the table and placed their books on it, Ron approached them, undeterred by the death glare he was receiving from Hermione. Rose. Ron said but hesitated to continue. He finally mustered the courage to ask, "Can you help my dad get his job back at the ministry?" Rose was truly taken aback by the red-haired boy's request. She really didn't expect Ron to ask her something like that. Clock Tower, Hermione corrected Ron's words. Ron was surprised by the correction and glared at the girl with thick brown hair. No one liked being corrected by others, especially a teenager. "No one asked you," Bookworm, Ron said almost instinctively, his tone irritated, not caring about Hermione's particularly calm gaze. After experiencing a real war and seeing people die, Hermione had matured a lot. Perhaps in the past, she would have been upset and hurt by the insults, but now she saw how childish and extremely spoiled Ron was. Do you think I'm offended by that? You need to read the dictionary more, Ronald. Hermione opened the second-year spellbook and subtly returned the insult, calling him stupid for not coming up with a better word to insult her. Ron's cheeks flushed with Hermione's words, anger and shame making him look at her with a gaze full of rage, ready to draw his wand at any moment. Let's not fight, the librarian is looking our way. Seeing Ron's face turn a shade similar to his hair, as if he were about to explode, Rose spoke to calm things down. She didn't want to be kicked out of the library again. Hermione and Ron exchanged glares in a battle of stares, but both relented and remained silent. I don't think you need to worry about your father's job. Headmaster Dumbledore wouldn't stand by while one of his colleagues needed help, Rose whispered to Ron, feeling the cold stare of the librarian on their group for a moment. Rose's words and the mention of Dumbledore seemed to calm Ron's tension, as his shoulders relaxed and he showed a happy and relieved expression again. Almost as if Dumbledore's name was a very effective calming agent. Did you hear? They say the war has become even fiercer on the battlefield. Ron lowered his voice and shared the information he had gotten from other students. Seeing Ron sit down and start talking to Rose, Hermione's eyes narrowed. She couldn't believe someone could be so shameless. Didn't he see the 2 piles of books next to Rose? Clearing her throat, Hermione gave Ron a dissatisfied look, growing even more frustrated as he ignored her and continued talking to Rose. We're busy, Ronald. Hermione couldn't take the whispers disrupting her concentration any longer and spoke sharply, drawing the attention of almost everyone in the library. Miss Granger, silence or you'll be expelled from the library. Irma Pants, the librarian, looked at Hermione and spoke in a reprimanding tone. Hermione, who had always been the exemplary student to the teachers, felt a wave of embarrassment as she noticed the eyes falling on her. Sitting back down, she glared at Ron with a vengeful and malicious look. Even Ron swallowed hard in the face of that deadly look, as if it promised revenge. Rose couldn't help but curl her lips into an amused smile. She felt that this was the school life she wanted, just silly and meaningless fights. For a moment, she wished that every day could be like this. Shaking her head to clear these unrealistic thoughts, Rose focused on her reading, occasionally jotting down relevant notes in a notebook. Battlefield, Death Eater camps. Everyone watched Bellatrix limping toward the main tent with shocked eyes. Although Bellatrix was crazy, no one ever questioned her strength. Seeing her in this state made everyone feel a chill run down their spines. Deep in the hearts of each one, the seed of desertion began to grow. If the powerful Bellatrix was so injured in this war, imagine them, mere wizards and witches of grades 3 and 2. Even the Aurors from France and Germany frowned. They had come to participate in this war to weaken Dumbledore's forces, but the way this war was going, they would die on this foreign land before even completing their respective missions. Bellatrix didn't care about the eyes falling on her. She held her head high and walked proudly despite being in a relatively grave condition. She walked to the main tent and entered, finding the Dark Lord sitting in a chair holding Nagini. A black diary lay on the table in front of him. His red eyes, which reminded her of Asterions, stared at her with a cold and calm gaze. My master, Bellatrix kneeled, ignoring her body protesting in pain. I see you are suffering, Bellatrix, Voldemort commented, stroking Nagini's scaly head. His gaze fell on the visible burns on her arms and legs. He, Bellatrix laughed joyfully. Despite the excruciating pain she was feeling, her lips curled into a cold smile. "You should see the other side, Master. I left a huge hole in his stomach." Voldemort nodded, not doubting her words. He knew his loyal subordinate well. "We will be starting," he said, drawing Bellatrix's attention. "Recover yourself and begin. You and 3 other Grade 1 wizards will attack Diagon Alley," Voldemort ordered, a strange gleam in his eyes, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table in front of him. Fear, he needed fear to turn this war in their favor. Bellatrix nodded and didn't question him, although she was clearly confused. Removing 4 Grade 1 wizards from the battlefield at this moment would leave a huge gap in their defenses, exposing their flanks too much to the enemy. "Yes, my master," Bellatrix replied and stood up, preparing to leave. However, she halted her steps upon hearing Voldemort's voice again. "Bellatrix, you won't betray me, will you?" The cold, hissing voice sent shivers down her spine. Bellatrix looked over her shoulder with a cheerful smile. "I will never betray my true master," she said, her voice tinged with insane fanaticism. Voldemort looked at her and nodded, a satisfied expression on his face. "Dumbledore and Asterion, you don't want others getting involved, but this is war. By nature, war is cruel and treacherous. And war is always written by the victors," Voldemort murmured, staring directly into Nagini's serpentine eyes. The Maledictus simply hissed as if responding to her master. Chapter 96 The War Intensifies, 2. At 9:15 in the morning, when Diagon Alley was bustling with witches and wizards going about their daily shopping, a massive explosion sounded. Boom! After the attack on Gringotts, Diagon Alley was once again attacked. The blast shattered all the windows and storefronts along the street, sending sharp shards of glass raining down. Terrified screams echoed through the commercial hub, followed by people running without regard for one another. In a moment of fear and desperation, humans and wizards were not so different, both ran for their lives. One of the Death Eaters pointed his wand to the sky and incanted a spell. Mors Mordra. In the sky, a gigantic green skull with a serpent emerging from its mouth appeared, making some older individuals feel as if they had returned to the hell of the war 13 years ago. Bellatrix, now healed, pointed her wand at the street filled with witches and wizards with a cruel smile. She flicked her wrist and silently cast a spell. Bombarda Maxima. An invisible spell shot from the tip of her wand, and in the next moment, boom, Bellatrix's black hair was blown back by the forceful winds of the explosion. She narrowed her eyes, a sadistic smile on her lips. A scene worthy of being mistaken for hell unfolded before her. Faced with such destructive power, hundreds of people turned into a cloud of blood, painting the walls and ground. It all happened in an instant, no one had time to react or counterattack. The other 3 Grade 1 wizards showed no mercy either and began to bombard all of Diagon Alley. A greater pandemonium had erupted in the magical commercial center of England. When the Aurors arrived moments after the attack, they were met with a horrific scene. Even the veterans, who had seen it all, averted their eyes from the gruesome and cruel display. The younger Aurors couldn't bear it and vomited everything they had eaten that morning. It took a while for everyone to compose themselves and start protecting people and counter-attacking the Death Eaters. Rufus, head of the Aurors, even after the dissolution of the Ministry of Magic, pointed his wand at one of the Death Eaters, and a life-and-death battle ensued. The veteran Auror seemed like a deadly machine, unleashing spell after spell without giving his opponent room to breathe. Everything around them was torn apart by the magic, brutally ripping through houses and entire buildings. Other Aurors who were not as strong as Rufus, gathered into a formation and attacked the other Death Eaters. Even though they could not truly kill the opponent, they could fight for hours like this, delaying the enemies until reinforcements arrived. Bellatrix was trapped by 10 Aurors. She dodged a spell and used Protego the next moment to protect herself from the enemy's spells. She did not use her cursed spirits, not because she felt sorry for the Aurors, but on orders from Voldemort. She was ordered not to destroy Diagon Alley, only cause death and chaos. This greatly limited her means of attacks. Blocking the more than 20 golden Expelliarmus thrown, Bellatrix knew she couldn't go on like this. Even though she was a grade 1 witch, she did not have infinite magical energy. At the same time, the worry of reinforcements arriving at any moment made her quicken her steps. Dodging a confundus, Bellatrix turned her wrist and launched an Expelliarmus at the Auror, catching him by surprise and throwing him back with force, but she didn't stop there. Reinforcing her body with 20% of her magical energy, she stomped heavily onto the ground. The ground sank 1 meter into the ground and strong tremors occurred every 20 meters, throwing the Aurors off balance. Bellatrix took her chance and apparat to one of the houses above and ran across the roofs of the houses. The Aurors followed her, still maintaining a strict military training, always casting spells to get in Bellatrix's way. While running across the rooftops, Bellatrix stopped and spun in the air dodging the spells. When she was about to fall back onto the rooftops, she spun upside down in the air and used the hand that touched the roof to gain momentum again. Using her other hand, she aimed her wand at one of the Aurors and made a half-moon movement, as if cutting something invisible. Across the street. On top of the roof of a house, the Auror didn't even have time to react before being cut in half by a Diffindo spell. His body split into two, with his upper body slipping and falling, leaving only his lower body still standing. Blood, viscera and organs stained the entire roof. Seeing the death of their comrade in arms, the Aurors attacked even more strongly, full of anger and hatred appearing on their faces. As Bellatrix once again continued to stall for time, the battle between Rufus and the Death Eater came into full swing. The entire street was completely unrecognizable, with charred walls and houses in complete ruin. Meanwhile, both wizards continued to exchange spells for 5 consecutive minutes. Spell after spell, blow after blow, both faced each other putting their lives at risk. Whoever made the first mistake would die. Snap! A sound resembling a car's exhaust echoed not far away. Gregory Goyle, Patriarch of the Goyle House, almost instantly cast a spell towards the origin of the sudden noise. The spell pierced through the air and hit the location of the sound, but it didn't hit anyone. Without hesitation, Gregory retreated while skillfully blocking every spell cast by Rufus. Meanwhile, his eyes scanned the surroundings for any wizard. The Patriarch of the Goyle House was absolutely certain he had heard someone apparating, and he trusted his instincts. There was someone present besides him and Rufus Scrimgeour. Suddenly, every hair on Gregory's body stood on end as he sensed imminent danger. The feeling that death was looming over him caused a significant change in the Patriarch's expression. What frightened Gregory the most was that no matter how much he distanced himself, the sense of danger didn't diminish. On the contrary, it grew stronger with each passing moment. He wanted to apparate away, but apparating wasn't instantaneous. Though there was only a small window of time until the spell was successfully executed, 0.5 seconds was enough for an experienced wizard like Rufus to kill. Then, a drastic change in the situation occurred. Gregory watched in slow motion, unbelieving, as his chest was pierced by a spell, and his heart exploded. With widened eyes, the small figure of Filius was revealed before Gregory, who looked at the half-blood he considered filthy with a mix of rage and fear. Filthy! Before he could finish speaking, his head was blown off by a bombarda used by the Hogwarts professor. Filius might have lost to Voldemort, but to any other grade 1 wizard or witch, he was a deadly nightmare. Mr. Scrimgeour, I will continue hunting down the Death Eaters. Take the time to assist those in need. Filius turned to Rufus, who looked at him with respect, and spoke with a serious and courteous tone. Have they sent reinforcements? Rufus asked, looking at the small man before him. No. With the gap in Voldemort's defenses, all grade 1 wizards and above have attacked with full force. Filius shook his head, informing Rufus about the ongoing situation in the main battlefield at that moment. Rufus didn't ask anything further. Once Filius finished killing all the grade 1 wizards, he would use his aurors to initiate rescues and aid. Seeing that Rufus had no more questions, Filius disappeared before Rufus's eyes. Chapter 97 The Death of Voldemort. 1. The attack by the Death Eaters on Diagon Alley caused a dark cloud to cover all of England. Fear, which had not manifested since the beginning of the war, exploded all at once. People began to leave the country en masse, making the situation extremely complex. Upon seeing the low morale of the soldiers in the camp, Asterion's face became extremely grim. A pentagram appeared in his eyes, reflecting his feelings at that moment. The entire sense of security and the belief that the war was under control, which he and Dumbledore had created, was shattered by the attack on Diagon Alley. Fear and uncertainty completely reversed the morale on the battlefield. Even the victory of advancing on the battlefield did not change this feeling. Even the death of 3 level 1 wizards on the Death Eaters' side did not change anything. The death of hundreds of witches and wizards in Diagon Alley made uncertainty cloud everyone's thoughts on the battlefield, and they wondered if their families would be the next victims. This was a common concern in the minds of almost everyone. Asterion knew he had to do something to boost morale. Otherwise, even if this war was won, the image of the clock tower would be one of weakness and incapacity. Technically, Dumbledore, with his incomparable prestige in the soldiers' minds, was the most suitable to boost morale, but since he was not at the camp, this role fell on the shoulders of the heir of Black. But Asterion was not very good with words, so instead of giving an epic and motivating speech to all the soldiers, he used actions instead of pretty words. He would kill Voldemort at that moment, promoting that the clock tower was powerful and could guide England to a better future. Below Asterion, a curtain of black smoke manifested, and Nidhogg emerged from the portal with his master on his head. The enormous crimson dragon rose to the skies, attracting the attention of everyone, be it the soldiers of the clock tower or the Death Eaters. Even the war that was happening at that moment on the battlefield completely ceased. The brutal and terrifying appearance of the enormous oriental dragon made the Death Eaters feel insignificant before that brutal force of nature. With the enormous dragon winding through the sky, Asterion above Nidhogg's head slowly closed his eyes and felt. Because of his innate technique, he could sense negative magical energy, and in his senses, the entire battlefield and England were filled with negative magical energy bubbling like soup in a cauldron. Like a maestro, he extended his hands forward and moved them. Before the eyes of thousands of witches and wizards, all the blue negative magical energy on the battlefield transformed into rivers of icy blue energy and flowed toward the sky, precisely to Asterion atop Nidhogg. He continued, molding this energy into a cruel and cold melody, where parents bury their children and children bury their fathers, a song of hatred, resentment, and fear, an endless cycle of hatred where both sides killed each other on the whimsical orders of others. War. The cursed spirit began to take shape as Asterion poured more of his desires into the core of the cursed spirit. Soon, a gigantic figure appeared above the battlefield. Piercing through its skull was the body of a gun, below which was a grotesque mouth full of teeth resembling knives. Its hands were rifles and machine guns, its chest was strong and broad with bones protruding outward, and instead of legs, it had bullet belts swaying in the wind. When the cursed spirit fully manifested in the sky, a malevolent and cold feeling spread through the surroundings. The immense amount of negative magical energy subtly changed the environment, bringing an incomparable chill. Even the Death Eaters hugged themselves, trying to seek some warmth in the immense feeling of coldness and cruelty emanating from the cursed spirit floating in the sky. Even Voldemort stepped out of his tent and looked in its direction with a calm and composed look. Despite the powerful cursed spirit, his lips curled into a cold smile. Seeing the gun demon before him, Asterion lowered his hand, making the enormous cursed spirit follow his movements and take a posture that resembled someone kneeling before their king. It can be said that this image would remain in the minds of countless people for a long time, earning Asterion his first epithet, Prince of Evil. Asterion commanded the cursed spirit to aim at the enemy camp with a calm expression. When the cursed spirit turned and aimed at the Death Eaters' camp, everyone in it felt a chill run through their bodies, trembling from head to toe. Voldemort, seeing this, showed an expression of dissatisfaction with the acts of clear betrayal of the customs of war. Pawn attacks pawn, and king attacks king. Rising into the air, the Dark Lord elevated himself to the same level as Asterion. What is the meaning of this, Asterion? Voldemort spoke, his voice cold and his expression impassive, even before two gigantic cursed spirits. Can't you see, Tom? I'm training. Showing a relaxed expression, Asterion, atop Nidhogg's head, crossed his legs and responded casually, not bothering to invent a better lie. He even called Voldemort by his real name on purpose to irritate him. Hearing the name he was called, Voldemort's face contorted. If you want to fight, say so, don't hide behind obvious lies. That was extremely rude. I'm obviously training, can't you see? To prove he was telling the truth, Asterion made the gun demon fire millions of shots at a nearby mountain, deliberately passing over the Death Eaters' camp. The mountain, which took the full impact, ceased to exist the next moment, and a powerful explosion reverberated across the horizon, shaking the entire battlefield as if an earthquake had struck. See, I'm training. Showing an innocent look on his face, Asterion spoke with a firm and determined tone. Ha ha ha. Voldemort began to laugh, a cold and hissing laugh, his gaze filled with anger at Asterion's obvious lie. He raised his hand and murmured. Innate spell manipulation, corruption of evil gods, universal decay. A halo of dark energy appeared in both of Voldemort's hands as he took a fighting stance, looking coldly at Asterion. Seeing Voldemort's actions, Asterion laughed and pointed his finger upwards, murmuring calmly, his voice spreading across the battlefield. Innate spell manipulation, creation and manipulation of cursed spirits, summoning. Above Asterion, 10 gigantic vortices of the purest darkness manifested. The enormous amount of negative magical energy drastically changed the environment, making the world seem to take on a darker hue. The witches and wizards below, seeing the two leaders finally about to clash, quickly disappeared from the battlefield. No one wanted to be killed casually by the shockwaves when the battle officially began. Asterion wanted to laugh but restrained himself. Unlike the fight against the special grade wizard using Mustafa's body, today he could fully manifest his cursed spirits without being drained in an instant. You die today, Tom Marvolo Riddle. Asterion spoke, his voice cold as a pentagram appeared in his red eyes. A full suit of armor with a crown floating above his head manifested on him. Today he would go all out against Voldemort, and the Dark Lord who had terrorized the British Isles would die today, like a sacrificial animal for his future. We'll see about that, Asterion Black. Voldemort pronounced coldly, his eyes like those of a snake staring at its prey. When he finished speaking, the Dark Lord disappeared and reappeared in front of the Crimson Dragon, punching it with colossal force. Boom! The punch smashed Nidhogg's entire face, splattering a large amount of purple blood. Voldemort didn't stop, he spun in the air and kicked towards Asterion's head. Asterion raised his arms and blocked the kick but was thrown backward, sliding through the air at great speed. After stabilizing himself in the air, Asterion looked at his arms where the kick had landed. His black armor with numerous terrifying red eyes was falling apart, and he could feel an aura of decay corroding his armor. Pouring more magical energy into the armor, it fully regenerated in an instant. That was a good kick, Asterion murmured, touching his armored arm. He would have to worry about Voldemort's attacks now, he wasn't a cursed spirit that could regenerate infinitely. If Voldemort's attack hit him without his armor, he would suffer significant damage. Nidhogg, whose face had been completely distorted by Voldemort's punch, regenerated in the same second and became utterly furious, storm clouds covering half of England. The thunderous sounds reverberated in the sky, with red electric lights dancing like snakes in the black clouds. The gun demon also didn't remain idle, letting out a cruel laugh and pointing its weapons at Voldemort. In the same instant, both special-grade cursed spirits attacked. Bullets the size of houses and gigantic bolts of lightning assailed Voldemort, who showed no concern for the attacks. A black halo covered his entire body, enveloping him like a flickering flame. All attacks, no matter how powerful, were forced to decay when they touched the black energy halo, turning into nothing. With his hair fluttering in the fierce winds caused by Nidhogg's stormy weather, the black pentagram in Asterion's eyes began to spin, analyzing everything and anything related to Voldemort's innate technique. In Asterion's mind, countless mathematical forms, graphs, and scales began to appear. The overwhelming amount of information distorted his face with agonizing pain. Various other black pentagrams began to appear in his field of vision, a nearly insane, crazed smile forming on his lips. Analyze and destroy. A whisper escaped Asterion's lips. A tiny dark red lightning bolt shot out from one of his eyes, tearing through the air with a buzzing sound. Voldemort, who had been calm until a moment ago, felt all the hairs on his body stand on end at the imminent danger, every cell in his body screaming at him to flee as quickly as possible. He only had time to move slightly to the side, attempting to dodge the attack, but a dark red energy bolt still hit his shoulder. When the dark red energy bolt struck his shoulder, all matter disintegrated, blood, muscles, bones, and flesh, all turning to nothing, leaving a massive hole from the base of his neck to his shoulder. Voldemort's eyes widened as he looked at the enormous hole in his shoulder with a horrified and incredulous gaze. The fear of death, hidden since he was a child, exploded all at once. Voldemort's red eyes turned to Asterion, and he finally noticed the pentagram in Asterion's eyes, his own eyes widening even more. "You're insane. How could you perform that suicidal surgery?" Voldemort screamed hysterically, feeling death approaching. The fear, terror, and envy made him look like a madman at that moment. "That look on your face is good. I'll put it in an animated portrait at the entrance of the Black Mansion," Asterion said, showing a wide smile. Despite feeling his entire body writhing in pain and his head almost exploding from the sheer amount of information, he felt that all the price he paid was worth it at that moment. He wondered if this was how Rose felt when using the 6 eyes to their fullest extent. This feeling of omniscience was almost addictive, as if everything was within his grasp. Voldemort's face twisted grotesquely at Asterion's humiliating words. Joining his hands and making a seal, he opened his mouth and screamed, full of anger and fury. Domain expansion, final decay of the universe. Asterion was not to be outdone and also used his domain expansion. Domain expansion, dark side of the primordial universe. Both materialized their innate techniques, their souls exposed in the barriers forming around them. Asterion's expansion emerged behind him like a dark vortex, a cold and lifeless abyssal vastness, swallowing all the malice and sins accumulated by humanity, a pit of all conceivable evil. Voldemort's expansion emerged behind him like a universe at the end of its life, devoid of any sign of life, atoms so still that the already cold universe remained eternally frozen in time. When the two worlds collided, a mushroom cloud rose to the skies. The ground was torn and shredded, large chunks of earth were hurled upwards, and a violent shockwave swept across the land, dragging everything and anything with it. Chapter 98 The Death of Voldemort, 2, and End of the First Volume. After the explosion from the collision of domain expansions, what followed was the purest brutality tearing through the fabric of reality. The sky changed completely in color, becoming a mix of darkness and redness. Black sparks like somber snow fell across the battlefield. Within the domain expansion, Asterion and Voldemort faced each other. While Asterion maintained a calm expression, Voldemort stared back with a crazed and fearful look. He felt his domain expansion losing in the battle, not due to a difference in techniques, but because of the amount of magical energy used. The opposing side had poured an incalculable amount of magical energy, and he had not done so. In less than a blink of an eye, Voldemort's domain expansion shattered before his widened eyes. He saw it fragment like shards of glass passing before him, and before he could articulate any word, Asterion's expansion enveloped him. Voldemort found himself in a pit of pure malevolence, where all the resentment, hatred, and rage of humanity converged in one place. Millions, billions, trillions of voices overlapped, creating an infernal angelic choir echoing in his mind. His deepest fear was infinitely amplified, a sensory experience no human had ever witnessed. The avalanche of sensations flooding his brain was so overwhelming that he couldn't move or speak, only his eyes widened in indescribable horror. A thick, black liquid akin to tar began to cover Voldemort's body, starting from his feet and slowly creeping up his legs. The liquid seemed to have a life of its own, pulling him down into a steaming, viscous sea. As the black liquid enveloped him, Voldemort's expression became increasingly terrified. He raised his hand in a desperate plea for help, but it was futile. Only his head remained above the tar, his eyes reflecting the absolute terror of an inevitable fate. When the domain expansion dissipated, Asterion observed the Dark Lord, who had terrorized England, kneeling on the ground, gazing silently and madly at the sky. Saliva dribbled from Voldemort's mouth as he could no longer express any emotion on his face. Taking a step towards Voldemort, Asterion materialized a long black sword in his hand, adorned with several red eyes. The sword measured 2 meters in length and 5 centimeters in width. Approaching the kneeling man, Asterion shifted the sword's position, holding it point down, with the blade's tip just inches from Voldemort's eye. Asterion's red eyes gazed calmly and serenely at the man. Not at all relieved to have defeated Voldemort. After all, if he hadn't managed to win even after awakening his second innate technique, Asterion might as well kill himself in shame. The soldiers of the Clock Tower and the Death Eaters appeared on the battlefield as silence fell over the scene, everyone watching Voldemort kneeling before a 13-year-old boy, about to be killed by him. The battlefield went completely quiet, interrupted only by the rapid breaths of all present. "It's been a displeasure knowing you, Tom Marvolo Riddle," Asterion said coldly, devoid of any mockery or disdain, perhaps granting the minimum respect a monster like Voldemort might deserve at the end of his life. Without hesitation, Asterion fortified his body with magical energy and swung down his sword with force. The blade pierced Voldemort's right eye and continued downward, cutting through him from top to bottom. The man, who had become deranged after Asterion's domain expansion, did not react even as the sword passed through his body. Until the end, his gaze remained fixed on the sky, as if imagining something that no one else would ever know. A barrage of applause erupted from the clock tower soldiers. No one was happier than they were to see Voldemort finally dead, the same monster who had killed their loved ones and friends. Asterion retrieved the sword from Voldemort's body, splattering blood on his face and clothes. Despite the applause, his face showed little emotion. His red eyes reflected a surprising calm. Perhaps what he truly felt was boredom. Even the satisfaction he thought he would feel upon killing Voldemort did not come, as if he had done something mundane. Asterion's gaze focused on the lifeless body lost in thought. Meanwhile, in the Death Eaters' camp, all Death Eaters fled without a second thought, abandoning the cause they had fought for. The witches and wizards from Germany and France who had been involved in the Civil War also retreated after Voldemort's death. Bellatrix was sitting in the main tent with a large snake in her hands. Not far from her, lying on the ground, was the body of her ex-husband, Rodolphus Lestrange, the patriarch of the House of Lestrange. His eyes had been gouged out and his tongue cut, numerous torture wounds covering his body. Nagini's gaze in Bellatrix's arms at that moment was entirely different from the look the snake had before. This was a cold and somber gaze. "Let's go, Bellatrix," a cold male voice came from the snake's mouth, which was utterly shocking. Each Horcrux had its own life, so what happened to Voldemort was not transferred to this Horcrux. But Bellatrix didn't move a muscle despite the order from her apparent master. Instead, she looked at the snake with a mixture of anger and disgust. "You've ruined my master's plan," she said, continuing unabated by the snake's shocked gaze. "I was supposed to redeem myself in the eyes of the people and rise as a heroine who killed the dreaded Dark Lord. But none of that came to pass as my master intended, all because of you. But it doesn't matter anymore at this moment, my master will become a hero in the eyes of the people." At that moment, Voldemort didn't need to hear any more. He knew Bellatrix was a traitor, and her betrayal came at a terrible time when he had no means to protect himself. Before Voldemort could say anything, he saw Bellatrix stand up and walk over to his diary, his other Horcrux. With calm eyes, he watched her take a vial from her bag and carefully drop a drop onto the diary. He was confident in the durability of his Horcruxes, mere liquid wouldn't destroy them. But he couldn't maintain his calm demeanor as he saw the diary emit green smoke and a mournful scream echoed in the tent, accompanied by a face resembling Voldemort's own. "Impossible! Impossible!" Before he could finish his hysterical shout, he felt Nagini's body begin to stiffen. He knew what was happening. This Horcrux too had been poisoned by Bellatrix's strange liquid, and he was about to die. The most feared and powerful Dark Lord to ever set foot on the British Isles would die from mere poisoning. "Basilisk venom," Bellatrix spoke, shaking the vial containing the poison. "My master gave it to me to destroy all your Horcruxes at the right moment." Voldemort widened his eyes and realized that all his other Horcruxes would be in Asterion Black's hands. Even at the end of his life, he still couldn't understand how his Horcruxes were discovered, especially by Asterion Black. Full of resentment and hatred, Voldemort's eyes closed for the last time. The Dark Lord, Voldemort, was dead. Hogwarts headmaster's office. Watching Rose writhing in bed, her face showing a pained expression, Dumbledore's face grew dark. He knew Tom was struggling to take over Rose's body through the Horcrux. If Rose lost the battle and Voldemort won, Dumbledore couldn't imagine what Voldemort could do using Rose Potter's body. Though the chance was minimal, Albus Dumbledore firmly held the Elder Wand, ready to end Rose's life the moment she showed signs of losing the battle. Suddenly, Dumbledore noticed Rose's face relaxing, and the girl soon opened her eyes to his surprise. The most powerful man in the world hadn't noticed, but Rose's eyes seemed different, reflecting the universe itself. From the girl's body emerged green smoke that took on the face resembling Tom Riddle. This face roared reluctantly before disappearing completely. "How are you, Rose?" Dumbledore discreetly stowed away his wand and asked with a concerned tone. Finally free and enlightened, Rose whispered, still looking directly at the ceiling, her pupils glimpsing the vastness of emptiness and a cold, boundless universe. A crazed smile outlining her lips. Chapter 99, Decision, 1, Former Ministry of Magic, now Clock Tower, Parliamentary Hall. The Parliamentary Hall was an enormous room supported by gigantic Greek pillars, the ceiling divinely painted with a grand artwork depicting the creation of the origins of magic. The floor was so clean it could easily serve as a mirror. In the center of the hall, there was an imposing black rectangular table with 24 seats, at least 18 of which were occupied by witches and wizards. At the far end of the hall, elevated by numerous steps on a flat platform, there were 12 seats resembling thrones. "This is an insult from those damn French." Vincent Parkinson, Patriarch of House Parkinson, Lord of the Department of Creation, slammed his fist against the table and spoke with an extremely irritated tone. He was not the only one who was extremely irritated. Whether lord or senator, regardless of who they were, they all displayed dark expressions. The reason for the anger was obvious, a letter sent by the French delegation moments ago, which everyone present had read and were furious about. "Why don't we return to the 100 Years' War?" Bartemius Crouch proposed with a cold, deadly look. His proposal made at least 4 senators agree with the suggestion to go to war. If you looked closely, you would see that all 4 senators belonged to a faction, the same one he was part of. "Do not let anger cloud your judgment, Your Excellency. We just came out of a civil war 6 months ago, we definitely don't want to enter another war at this moment. The people would be furious with the clock tower." Aurelius Greengrass, Patriarch of House Greengrass, Lord of the Department of Botany, spoke, calming everyone. Yes, it had been 6 months since the Civil War had ended and everything had returned to normal without many changes. The only change was that the Ministry of Magic had been successfully dissolved and the Clock Tower had risen as the supreme governing body in England. In these 6 months, regardless of which faction you belonged to, everyone joined together to maintain order and heal the wounds of the Civil War. Thus, in these 6 months that had passed, England had reached its peak with a cohesion rarely seen in centuries in this country. "I apologize, Lord." Bartemius sat down in his chair, a bit disheartened, and responded in a slightly lower and tired voice. No one spoke against the old Patriarch of House Crouch. Everyone knew that the man had lost everything in the 13-Year War, and even more in this civil war, where his only descendant, who was a Death Eater, was killed, leading to the near extinction of House Crouch. "We all understand that you want to vent your anger, Your Excellency," Aurelius said in a calm tone, shifting his gaze to the others present. "How do you think we should respond to the letters from the French Ministry of Magic?" Asterion, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Let's accept the proposal." Seated in the Lord of the Department of Curses seat, Asterion captured everyone's attention in the parliamentary hall. "Everyone must be wondering why we should accept the French proposal," he said, remaining indifferent to the curious glances. "We must accept, and not only accept but also host the Tri-Wizard tournament in our country. We need to show our strength, despite the grudge we hold against the French wizards. Especially now, having just emerged from a civil war, people need a joyful event to completely dispel the shadow of war. Asterion finished his speech and took a sip of tea, maintaining a calm and composed gaze over the parliamentary hall. Due to the low number of parliamentarians and lords, the three factions had fragmented, and power was decentralized and reorganized in a way that accommodated everyone. The pure-blood faction transformed into the aristocratic faction and became the most powerful in Parliament, with 5 lords: Black, Greengrass, Parkinson, Macmillan, and Malfoy. All were involved in some way with House Black. The neutral faction, after House Greengrass left as the leader, weakened considerably, with only 3 lords remaining in Parliament: Morgan, Foley, and Beck. The Light faction reorganized as the Democratic faction, becoming the second most powerful in Parliament, with 4 lords: Abbott, Ollivander, and 2 members of Muggle descent. This alleviated the few remaining great noble houses after the Civil War, where 7 great noble houses, which laid the foundations of British wizarding society, were officially considered extinct. Along with the great houses that became extinct in the war 13 years ago, more than half of the Sacred 28 disappeared in less than 2 decades. It's worth noting that Lucius Malfoy was imprisoned in Azkaban after the war and succeeded by his eldest son, Draco Malfoy. However, due to his young age, the Lord's seat of House Malfoy was under the regency of House Black until Draco was old enough to inherit the Lord's seat in Parliament. As for Asterion, almost 14 years old, seated in the Lord's seat, no one present in that hall considered Asterion a child. Besides being a special grade wizard, the boy had killed the most terrible Dark Lord who had set foot on this island. After hearing Asterion's words, everyone remained silent. They knew that Lord Black was right, but the ingrained prejudice of the English against the French was not something easy to resolve, especially considering that France had sent elite wizards to join the civil war on Voldemort's side. This had made the relationship between the two nations even more tense than it already was, almost seeming as if the 100 Years' War was on the horizon, about to explode at any moment. Someone just needed a match, and the gasoline would do the job of starting the conflict between the two nations. Seeing everyone still silent, reluctant to accept the proposal, Asterion placed the teacup on the table and spoke again. Instead of a Triwizard tournament, why don't we change it? Let's create an international magic tournament, invite neighboring countries, and crush those pompous, arrogant, candy-addicted blondes in front of other nations. Asterion's words caused everyone's faces to brighten. The idea of crushing the arrogant French fools in front of other nations was quite tempting for them. After a brief silence, Asterion spoke again. All in favor, raise your hand. Immediately after, the Black Heir raised his hand in support, followed by the entire aristocratic faction who stood behind their leader. After a palpable hesitation in the air, the remaining 4 lords present raised their hands, expressing their support for the proposal. 90% of the senators also raised their hands, thus deciding in favor. The first international magic and witchcraft tournament would be held in England. Author's note: this is the 2nd volume of this fanfic. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry for the short chapter. I'm working on the script and timeline for the upcoming chapters, which is taking longer than I had anticipated. However, there will be 2 chapters tomorrow. This volume will focus on the conflicts between countries and the rise of Grindelwald's and Herpo's plan. Expect interesting things, dear readers. Sincerely, Prince. Chapter 100, Decision, 2. When the doors of the Parliament opened, Aurelius Greengrass walked alongside his son-in-law. What did you think of the parliamentary meeting? He asked, looking at the group of senators ahead of them. It was Asterion's first time attending a parliamentary meeting since Arcturus had fully retired, passing the lordship to his great-grandson. Though Asterion had not yet inherited the patriarchal mantle and taken over the House of Black as patriarch, a moment that would only come upon Arcturus passing, according to the Salic laws governing England's inheritance laws. They seem strangely united, despite the contradictions among them, commented Asterion, spinning the ring on his finger. The ring's body was composed of 2 snakes, one silver and the other golden, with a beautiful black diamond held between their heads. Anyone familiar with the history of House Gaunt would recognize this same diamond in the ring of each Gaunt patriarch. Yes, when faced with a common enemy, it's not uncommon to see us all collaborating with each other. After all, while hatred may be enduring, only interests are eternal, Aurelius replied with a low chuckle, adjusting his cane. His blue eyes, reminiscent of Daphne's, fixed Asterion with a peculiar gaze, almost as if he were looking at a son he never had. Honestly, to Aurelius' eyes, it wasn't much different. He had always wanted a son to inherit his legacy, and though he never had one, he gained one through his daughter's marriage. Asterion understood the reasoning. Interests always came before everything else in the eyes of those in power. It was normal, akin to taking a cherished friend's job. There was nothing personal about it, just business. You need to be prepared, Asterion. We'll likely want you as the new face of England, so you'll need to greet all the guests coming for the International Tournament of Magic and Witchcraft, Aurelius continued, his voice calm and serene as they walked. Asterion nodded. Aurelius' words didn't surprise him. After killing Voldemort in front of everyone, his fame in England had arguably surpassed Rose's. Thus, it wasn't surprising that he would be the one greeting all foreign guests in the country. It was both a show of respect to other countries and a subtle demonstration of strength. It might seem somewhat childish to some, but that's how international politics worked. Those with the bigger cannon were the most powerful. Simple and straightforward. Aurelius and Asterion ascended the clock tower via the elevator that led to the street and entered a car. The car soon glided silently through the streets of London. Inside the car, Aurelius placed his cane beside him and his hat on the seat beside it. He looked at his son-in-law with a smile on his face as he crossed his legs. "So, when will your wedding with Daphne be?" he asked gently. Asterion widened his eyes, completely taken aback by Patriarch Greengrass's question. "Don't look at me like that, my wife Helena is more eager than I am for this wedding to happen." Aurelius chuckled and looked at Asterion's shocked face. It was the first time he had seen such an expression on his son-in-law's face. "We're very young, maybe when we turn 18 or 20. Recovering from the surprise, Asterion shook his head and replied uncertainly. Aurelius's question had indeed caught him off guard this time. Aurelius shook his head and asked, "How old do you think I am, Asterion? 30 or 33? Looking at the youthful face of the Greengrass family patriarch, Asterion calmly responded. "I'm glad you think I'm that young, but I'll be turning 51 by the end of the year." With a playful smile on his lips, Aurelius corrected his son-in-law in a friendly tone. He continued speaking calmly. "Wizards are different from muggles. We have a lot of difficulty reproducing naturally, which is one of the reasons there are so few wizards in the world. Helena became pregnant with Daphne when she was 37, despite trying hard to conceive for nearly 15 years. When I received the news that she was pregnant, I was over the moon with excitement. My waist could finally rest." Aurelius showed a nostalgic and bitter look on his face as he continued to speak. "This kind of thing is quite common in our world. Fleamont and Euphemia Potter were a good example of this. They only had children when they were elderly and didn't even live to see their son grow up and get married." Asterion fell silent at Aurelius's words. He knew that fertility issues were a serious matter among the noble houses, but marrying so early wasn't in his plans at the moment. Not that he was reluctant to marry Daphne in the first place, but he simply felt the timing wasn't right. After all, they were both 13, not yet 14. "I'll talk to Daphne about it." Asterion definitely couldn't say what he was thinking. Especially to his father-in-law, so that's all he could say for now. The rest of the journey continued in silence, but not an awkward silence, as both were reading some reports, until finally the trip ended. The car parked in front of the Greengrass mansion. Try talking to Daphne about marriage, Asterion. The door was opened by the driver, but before getting out of the car, Aurelius spoke again with a friendly smile. Asterion could only nod and watch his father-in-law enter the mansion, letting out a relieved sigh. This conversation about marriage had left him quite weary, something he hoped he would never have to deal with. Nolan, let's head to the Black Mansion. Looking at the driver, Asterion leaned back in the rear seat and spoke with his eyes closed. Arriving at the mansion, Asterion entered while loosening his tie around his neck and walked into the living room. To his surprise, he found Narcissa sitting on the sofa reading a newspaper, which made him look at her with a strange gaze. It was the first time Asterion had seen her reading the newspaper in years. Did something important happen? Lying down on the sofa, he rested his head on Narcissa's thighs and casually asked, placing his arm over his eyes. To his surprise, his cousin actually responded with a serious tone. Yes. Something really significant happened, she said, handing the newspaper to Asterion. Sitting up, he took the newspaper and opened it to the page Narcissa indicated, widening his eyes as he looked at the article. On this Monday, France, Germany, Italy, Austria, Spain, and Portugal suffered massive attacks on their respective ministries of magic. The reasons behind the Dark Lord's reprisals are still unknown, but according to sources, nearly 3,000 wizards and witches lost their lives in a single day. Since the Middle Ages, this is the highest number of wizarding deaths recorded in nearly 6 centuries. Grindelwald is finally spreading his terror across the European continent. At this moment, protests are occurring in various European countries, with the population demanding the Dark Lord's arrest and death sentence. Grindelwald's plan has officially begun. This was Asterion's only thought after reading the articles in the newspaper. Though he didn't exactly know what Gellert Grindelwald's plan entailed, he knew it was far from simple, much like his plan to create a god or Mustafa's plan to reach the root of all magic. The world is becoming increasingly mad, Asterion murmured to himself, his eyes intensely serious yet calm. The staircase appeared, but few would have the courage to climb its steps. Chapter 101, Decision 3. Asterion finally understood why France had sent such a sudden invitation to host a Triwizard tournament. It was likely an excuse to create a coalition against Grindelwald. For this, England was essential, not just because of Dumbledore, but because of himself, recognized as a powerful wizard of special rank after killing Voldemort. Displaying a malicious smile, Asterion had already thought of numerous ways to blackmail the French government. After all, if they wanted him to work, they had to pay, and pay very well. He was a lion, and France was a succulent steak ready to be devoured at any moment. Seeing Asterion with a malicious smile, Narcissa rolled her eyes. Her dear cousin looked like a villain, orchestrating nefarious plans with that characteristic villainous grin. Stop smiling like that, you look like a villain. Playfully poking his cheek with her index finger, Narcissa chuckled and spoke in a teasing tone. Asterion realized he wasn't alone and pretended to cough to cover up the embarrassment he was feeling. I haven't seen Doria. Asterion skillfully changed the subject, shifting Narcissa's focus completely. The woman's lips curved into a smile as she thought of her daughter. She returned to the Malfoy Manor, but she'll be back for dinner with Draco. Narcissa replied happily and relievedly. Asterion nodded and felt relieved that Narcissa didn't dwell on the embarrassing scene he had made earlier. As for Doria, The girl had grown much closer to her mother after the Civil War, where she saw all the dark sides while living at the Lestrange Manor, especially after Lucius Malfoy's imprisonment. Even Draco had begun to draw closer to his mother, as his father languished in Azkaban prison, an outcome Asterion would ensure happened in a very painful manner. He hadn't forgotten the betrayal and pain that man had caused his cousin. "That's good, I wanted to speak with Draco about his seat in Parliament," Asterion replied, rising from the sofa. Narcissa nodded and said, "I'll talk to him about it. Now, go visit Arcturus, he's been waiting for your arrival." Asterion sighed heavily at the mention of his great-grandfather. The man was deteriorating more with each passing day. At this point, Arcturus couldn't even get out of bed without assistance, and it was evident how much he was suffering from his condition. Asterion had tried to heal his great-grandfather, but it was impossible. Even magical energy had its limits when manipulated by humans. As for using a cursed spirit, Asterion hadn't even considered that suicidal option. The negative energy of a cursed spirit was extremely corrosive. Putting it inside someone's body was akin to cancer, slowly killing its host. Humans weren't cursed spirits made of pure negative magical energy. While a cursed spirit could be virtually immortal as long as it had negative magical energy, humans were made of flesh, blood, and bones. Even with a great amount of magical energy, regeneration was impossible indefinitely. Reverse magical energy also had its limitations. Even Asterion couldn't regenerate a limb if he were to lose one someday, let alone cure something that was killing cells in a person's body. Giving Narcissa a kiss on the cheek, Asterion ascended the stairs to the upper floor. Upon reaching it, he walked to the door of the bedroom and stopped in front of it. Asterion knocked twice on the door before entering. As soon as he entered the room, Asterion's gaze fell upon Arcturus lying in bed, calmly holding an old photo album. The elderly patriarch of the Black family looked much thinner than before, even healing potions couldn't strengthen the man's body at this point. When the patriarch of the Black family saw Asterion entering, he smiled gently despite his extremely pale face. "How was your first parliamentary meeting?" Sitting in the chair beside the bed, Asterion replied, looking at his great-grandfather. "Educational, to say the least." Arcturus nodded satisfactorily at his response and spoke with a hoarse and tired voice. "Remember, Asterion. Don't trust those cunning foxes, they can act so well that many should be in Muggle movies." He spoke each word with great difficulty, almost as if merely speaking brought agonizing pain to him. Which wasn't entirely untrue, as his lungs were beginning to fail. Asterion didn't need Arcturus's words to know that Parliament was a battlefield, where instead of spells, words and lies were used to wage war. "Any important matters?" Flipping a page of the photo album, Arcturus asked, caressing a photo of his deceased wife. "We're going to host an international wizarding tournament." Grindelwald's acolytes attacked the ministries of magic in several European countries. Asterion summed it up in a few words as he removed his jacket and draped it over his own thighs. Arcturus stopped caressing the photo of his wife and turned his head so quickly that Asterion wondered if the man was truly ill. "I don't think hosting a wizarding tournament is appropriate in such troubled times," he asked with a serious and exceedingly strong tone, at that moment reverting to the old Arcturus. Displaying a malicious smile, Asterion replied, "France has requested to host the Triwizard Tournament." His words caused Arcturus's lips to curl into a scornful smile. Who would have expected that one day those arrogant French would seek help from us, the barbaric English? Just thinking about it, my day brightened with this news. At nearly 94 years of age, Arcturus immediately sensed the intentions of the French Ministry of Magic. Asterion chuckled at his great-grandfather's reaction, knowing Arcturus also harbored dislike towards the French, especially after French wizards' involvement in the Civil War 6 months prior. The tense relationship between England and France had lasted for centuries, intensifying further during the Hundred Years' War. With current French actions, this relationship had become even more strained. Arcturus's face then became exceptionally serious. He looked at his great-grandson and spoke with a concerned tone. Be cautious with other countries, we may be isolated if a world war truly breaks out. Use this tournament to secure allies, even if it means sacrificing some interests. Being isolated in a war is dreadful, especially for us on an island, we could be surrounded from all sides. Even in his final moments, Arcturus wanted to help Asterion. Even if it meant sacrificing his life to aid his great-grandson, he wouldn't hesitate. I understand, but I don't believe another magical world war will occur, Asterion replied. He could grasp Arcturus's concerns but didn't think this conflict would escalate into a world war. I will talk to other countries, especially the Nordic countries, to cover the North Sea, Asterion said seriously. Even though he doubted such a large conflict would break out, he wanted to be prepared just in case. A cautious man is a living man. Chapter 102 The Black Sisters 1. Crossing the barrier that protected the Black Mansion, the Tonks family car approached, and Nymphodora's eyes widened at the enormous building constructed in Victorian Gothic style. Fuck, this isn't a mansion, it's a damn palace. She instinctively cursed out loud, her hair changing to many colors, showing just how shocked she was. Andromeda, in the back seat with her daughter, gave her a reproachful look and reprimanded her without hesitation. Nymphadora Tonks, don't use that rude language, especially here. Nymphodora's hair turned red with embarrassment at hearing her name, but just as she was about to retort, her father Ted's look, he was driving, made her keep her mouth shut. However, she still murmured in a dissatisfied tone, "Don't call me Nymphadora." Shaking her head, Andromeda let out a tired sigh and focused on the enormous mansion, her eyes filling with a feeling of nostalgia and reluctance. The fists resting on her thighs clenched tightly, showing that the woman was not as calm as she appeared on the outside. Ted looked in the rearview mirror at his wife in the back seat and remained silent. He knew his wife better than anyone. Andromeda was so nervous that she was in the position she always took when she was anxious about something. Turning his gaze to the mansion, Ted showed a complex look. Being the cause of his wife's expulsion always brought a lot of guilt to the man, especially when he saw his wife looking at the photo album with longing eyes. Letting out a sigh, Ted focused and skillfully parked the car in front of the mansion. He turned off the car, put on the handbrake, and got out of the car, helping to open the door for his wife while his daughter got out on her own. "Thank you, Ted," Andromeda said after getting out of the car, giving a sweet smile to her husband and entwining her arm with his. When the family gathered in front of the door and knocked, the doors opened, revealing an old house elf. Andromeda almost immediately recognized the black house elf, Creature. "It's good to see you again, Creature." Andromeda greeted the elf with a sweet and gentle smile. "Lord Asterion awaits you in the drawing room." Ignoring Andromeda's greeting, the house elf gave the woman an unpleasant look and spoke in a humble tone. Andromeda couldn't help but show a bitter expression upon hearing the house elf's tone. Nymphadora, who heard everything, looked rudely at the mummy-like creature known as Creature. When she was impulsively about to draw her wand, she saw her father looking at her with an almost deadly gaze. Reluctantly putting her wand away, she looked at her father with an angry glare and then back at the house elf, as if promising that this wasn't over. Entering the mansion, the first thing the Tonks family saw was the enormous statue of the Black House ancestor, Corvinus Black. For some reason, in front of the statue, Tonks felt as if she was under the gaze of a very stern grandfather, especially since the statue's eyes, made of rubies, seemed almost alive for a moment. Andromeda picked up the hem of her skirt and curtsied gracefully to the statue. Ted, recalling the etiquette lessons his wife had made him attend, placed his hand over his chest and bowed slightly forward. Seeing this, Creature showed a satisfied and proud look, and he guided the entire Tonks family more efficiently than before. Without realizing it, they all arrived at a room with sofas and armchairs, a fireplace burning with crackling flames. The gaze of the entire Tonks family fell upon the young man and woman sitting side by side, each calmly sipping a cup of tea. Sissy. Andromeda, seeing her younger sister, couldn't help but smile again. Dromeda. Narcissa also smiled at her older sister. She stood up and embraced her. What a beautiful reunion, little sisters. Suddenly, the doors of the room were opened, and Bellatrix entered, ignoring the wide-eyed looks of Ted and Tonks. Bella. Andromeda was also shocked by her older sister's entrance. Finally seeing the three black sisters together for the first time, Asterion couldn't help but think they were completely different from each other. As if reading Asterion's mind, Bellatrix's lips curved into a malicious smile. Didn't I tell you, Master? My lovely mother probably cheated on my lovely father, look how different we are from each other. Bellatrix's words made Narcissa's and Andromeda's faces turn very dark. Bellatrix's words were no different from calling them bastards. Bella. Narcissa growled her older sister's name. Andromeda, next to her, also looked fiercely at her older sister. The two exchanged glances and confirmed each other's thoughts. Without any hesitation, they both rushed towards Bellatrix. Seeing this, Bellatrix turned and ran, fleeing without looking back even once. Don't run, Bella, and face our wrath. Andromeda shouted loudly with a big smile on her lips. I refuse. Bellatrix sped up. Even more with her words. Narcissa remained silent and jumped over the sofa, almost catching Bellatrix by a hair. Seeing the three grown women running around the room like mischievous children left Asterion speechless, but noticing the smiles on their lips, he realized that all three were having fun after a reunion of decades. Please, have a seat. Asterion gestured for Ted and Nymphadora to sit across from him on the sofa. Thank you for the invitation, Lord Black. Sitting on the sofa, Ted responded with a smile as well. Seeing his wife enjoying herself like this made him realize how much she missed her family. I wanted to surprise Arcturus. Although he hasn't said anything, the man still wants to see the whole family reunited once more. Asterion replied calmly, bringing the cup to his lips and tasting the tea. Ted nodded and remained silent. An awkward silence hung in the air. He really didn't have much to talk about with someone as powerful and famous as Asterion Black, a special grade wizard. Asterion, I joined the Aurors. Seeing her father's predicament, Tonks spoke with a big smile, her purple hair changing to a very bright gold, apparently very proud of joining the Aurors. Congratulations, Nymph. Asterion congratulated her with a very sincere tone. It was truly a great achievement to become an Auror at 20. Only the best of the best could become an Auror, especially right after graduating from Hogwarts. It was a notable accomplishment. Tonks lifted her head with pride and received the praise from the powerful special grade wizard as if it were natural, as if it were normal to be praised by powerful people. Please, avoid talking about Bellatrix when you're outside the mansion. Calmly drinking his tea, Asterion's red eyes fell on Ted and Tonks. Although it was just a normal look, to Ted and Nymphadora, it felt like a mountain on their shoulders. Both nodded, agreeing with Asterion's words. They could see that Asterion was serious. While they conversed, the three sisters finally tired of running and sat on the same sofa with a rather inelegant posture. You didn't manage to catch me. I'm still the best older sister in the world. Catching her breath, Bellatrix spoke, looking at her two sisters with an extremely proud look. This made Narcissa's and Andromeda's faces contort for a moment. Best older sister in the world. They couldn't believe her shameless words and snorted coldly. Let's go see the old man already. If we wait any longer, he might enter the coffin, literally. Bellatrix was indifferent to her sister's judging looks and spoke lazily. Chapter 103 The Black Sisters, 2. Arcturus was in bed, reading some old letters his wife had written to him during his missions in Europe. Seeing the elegant handwriting on the yellowed paper, a smile appeared on the old patriarch of the House of Black. Suddenly, the doors were abruptly opened. Arcturus didn't even need to lift his head to know that his great-niece, Bellatrix, had entered his room. She was the only person without etiquette in the mansion. But the patriarch soon raised his head, hearing more footsteps entering his room. His gaze fell on Bellatrix, Narcissa, and finally, Andromeda. He ignored everyone else, a gentle smile appearing on his face as he looked at Andromeda. Look at you, child. Arcturus said, looking at his great-niece, Andromeda. He glanced at Asterion, who was smiling at him, and understood his great-grandson's plan. Seeing the state of her powerful great-uncle, Andromeda's eyes filled with tears. From what she remembered, her great-uncle had always been tall and broad-shouldered. Now, seeing his frail and thin state shook the image of him in her mind. In her impression, even if the sky were to fall, the man would be there to hold it up, but seeing his current state, she realized he was just like any other person, and at this moment, just a gentle grandfather. You are married and already a mother, how can you cry like this? If Druella saw her daughter like this, she would scold you. Seeing his great-niece crying upon seeing him, Arcturus spoke in a tone of reproach, but much gentler. She would probably be furious. Bellatrix said, the image of her mother getting furious making her lips curve into a very happy smile. Andromeda wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes and rolled her eyes at her older sister's words. Meanwhile, Narcissa sat in the chair beside the bed, holding Arcturus's skeletal hand. That must be my great-granddaughter. Arcturus's gaze fell on Nymphadora, who was embarrassed by the gentle and warm look of the man lying in bed. Her purple hair changed color, turning crimson red. Seeing this, the smile on Arcturus's face grew even more. You have a wonderful gift. Work hard and you will become an excellent witch, child. He spoke in a gentle tone, happy that at the end of his life, he could be surrounded by his family again. As for the rules, they would follow them again in hell, like all the members of his house. Nymphadora nodded seriously and watched her mother happily conversing with the old man and her sisters with a happy look. It was the first time she had seen her mother smile like that. This made Tonks very happy. If she had known, she would have talked to Asterion much earlier. Asterion, who had been silent for fear of interrupting the reunion, suddenly looked towards the entrance of the mansion, a smile appearing on his lips as he sensed the familiar aura of his uncle, who soon arrived in the room. You're still alive, you arrogant old man. Sirius entered the room reeking strongly of alcohol. The smile on Arcturus's face vanished upon seeing his grandson. Humph, I won't die before you, you insolent brat. Are you cursing me to die young, old man? Sirius gritted his teeth at his grandfather's words. With the amount of alcohol you consume, I'm surprised your liver hasn't withered away yet. Arcturus scoffed, mocking his irresponsible grandson. Seeing the two about to argue at any moment, Andromeda let out a pleasant laugh. Although it seemed like a heated exchange, she could see that both cared deeply for each other. This was just their way of communicating. Hearing the laugh, Sirius's gaze fell on his cousin whom he hadn't seen in a long time. Andy. He greeted her with a smile and hugged her warmly, giving her a gentle kiss on the cheek. Look at your state, you're not taking care of yourself again, Sirius. Andromeda held Sirius's face and spoke in a gentle yet very stern tone. Sirius just showed an embarrassed smile while scratching the back of his head. Watching the interaction between Sirius and Andromeda, Bellatrix's lips curved into a malicious smile. This reminds me of when I caught Sirius and Andromeda kissing when we were kids. Our mother was completely furious, saying that Sirius had contaminated Andromeda. She spoke in a deliberately loud tone, making sure everyone heard her words clearly. Andromeda's pale cheeks flushed with her embarrassing past being revealed, especially with her husband and daughter present in the room. Sirius just pretended to cough, feeling the particularly cold gaze of his cousin's husband. Tonks's eyes widened at her mother's dark past. She hadn't expected her elegant and noble mother to have done something like that as a child. It seemed impossible given how well she knew her mother. Arcturus, seeing the scene, just laughed and felt fortunate to witness this before he died. Now he felt he could die without regrets. Asterion sat on the armrest of the chair where Narcissa was and smiled, watching everything, especially the smile on Arcturus's face. He knew he had made the right choice seeing him smile like that. Suddenly, Arcturus's voice called everyone's attention in the room. I have to apologize to you both, Bellatrix and Narcissa. Narcissa and Bellatrix looked confused at the old patriarch. I thought the grandsons of my former teammates, Abrax II Malfoy and Fulcrum IV Lestrange, were respectable men like their grandfathers, but over time, it proved otherwise. You had unhappy marriages because of me. I understand if you never forgive me for that. Arcturus spoke each word with difficulty, his face full of regret, especially seeing Andromeda's happy relationship with Ted. Note, Abrax II Malfoy and Fulcrum IV are OC characters. You don't need to worry about that, old man. Bellatrix spoke casually. Though Rodolphus was uninteresting, it was fun torturing him mentally for years. When she said this, Tonks and Ted looked horrified at her, but Sirius, Narcissa, Asterion, and Andromeda didn't show much reaction. They knew Bellatrix too well to be surprised by her words. Though my marriage was truly unhappy as you said, I still have beautiful children, so at least I have something to be happy about. Besides, you couldn't have known what Lucius was like. Narcissa held Arcturus's hand more firmly and spoke in a calm but gentle tone. Arcturus looked at his two great-nieces who didn't blame him for his mistakes and let out a tired, regretful sigh. Still, I feel awful for making life difficult for you both. It's all right, we still have time to enjoy life. Unlike you, old man. Bellatrix spoke proudly, her gaze discreetly focusing on Asterion. Narcissa beside her nodded silently, confirming her older sister's words. Arcturus let out another sigh, but a smile appeared on his lips. Although he didn't know if they were speaking the truth, it relieved one of his regrets. Dinner has been prepared and is waiting for us. Asterion spoke to everyone, including Ted and Nymphadora, skillfully changing the slightly tense atmosphere in the room. Arcturus, who couldn't get out of bed, gathered his strength, got down from the bed, and walked as if he had never been ill, although Andromeda and Narcissa were by his side for any emergency. As everyone walked to the dining room, Asterion approached Narcissa and whispered to her, Draco and Doria just arrived. Narcissa nodded and went to fetch her children for dinner. Sitting around the table, Arcturus looked at his entire family and smiled sincerely. It was truly good to see the Black Mansion full of life again after so long. He ate and drank like never before, and although the environment was quiet because everyone was eating, the atmosphere was truly cozy. Chapter 104 Rose's Past. 1. Rose always knew she was different, although her Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia always made her believe otherwise when in fact she was very special. They wanted her to be normal at all costs, but that wasn't possible for her. Seeing human-devouring monsters everywhere wasn't exactly something a normal child should be able to see, and Rose was able to see them. Rose knew she wasn't normal, not when her eyes could see the atomic molecules that make up the world. Not when she could instinctively manipulate space almost as if it were natural. She was special, and that made her happy. But what was a special child in a normal family supposed to do to stay sane in the face of this? Rose didn't know what other children would do in her place, but she chose to use sarcastic humor to keep from going crazy. She used sarcastic humor to add a bit of color to the reality she saw through her special eyes. She used it to defend herself against every derogatory remark her Uncle Vernon directed at her, or when her cousin tried to beat her up at school with his equally stupid friends. The reason for his aggression was the stupidest of all, just because she was different from him. Nothing more, nothing less. This made her understand that people didn't like those who were different from them. To defend herself from insults about the color of her hair and eyes, she put on a proud and strong mask. If the other side was arrogant, she was even more arrogant. Naturally, things didn't go the way she thought they would. Especially when she responded to the school teacher in the same arrogant manner. The number of times her Aunt Petunia was called to the principal's office that year increased by 200%. And like any parents who don't know how to raise a child, instead of talking, asking the reason, and explaining that it was wrong, she was always locked in her room. Not that the room could prevent her from leaving if she wanted to, but since it was her room and she didn't want to sleep under the stars, she refrained from destroying it. Rose's first serious fight, when she was about 7 years old, was against a very large, disgusting monster that looked like a caterpillar. And it was the first time she used red on something living. Since she was able to manipulate space, she used physics books as a training manual, though it took her a while to understand some of the more complex concepts in the books, but nothing too complicated for her eyes. According to Albert Einstein's theory, 7-year-old Rose created an attack called Red, an extremely strong repulsive force, capable of pushing everything in its path. The Red crushed the grotesque monster as if someone had smashed an insect, leaving behind a crater with a grotesque amount of purple blood around it. It was then that the 7-year-old girl, without a teacher or friends, began her nightly adventures fighting these aberrations. 11-year-old Rose woke up like any other day before this one. After going through her morning routine, she went downstairs and reached the kitchen, where she began making breakfast for herself and her family. While making their breakfast, Rose pretended to be momentarily careless and dumped an unusually large amount of pepper into the food meant for her uncle. "How careless of me," Rose murmured with a very wicked expression. She grabbed the pepper shaker and added a bit more to Dudley's plate midline horizontal ellipsis. As for Aunt Petunia, Rose assumed that hearing her son's screams would be enough to mentally torture the woman. Just imagining Dudley's face turning red like a shrimp as he ran desperately around the house made the smile on Rose's lips grow even wider. Humming cheerfully, Rose finished her breakfast and left the house. Unfortunately, she wouldn't be able to witness the funny scene that would be the Dursley family's breakfast. She had more important matters to attend to. In front of her house, Rose saw Mrs. Figg watching her intently, as if keeping an eye on her. The lost daughter of the Potter house really didn't know why this cabbage-smelling woman stared at her every day. Showing a V sign with her fingers to the woman, Rose gave a mocking smile and walked down the sidewalk with her hands in the pockets of her sweatpants. Little whinging wasn't exactly big, but Rose knew that beneath this seemingly peaceful town, monsters devoured people, and for some reason, these monsters were generated by the negative emotions that normal people unconsciously emitted. As to why this happened, even with her eyes, Rose had no idea, but she knew it had something to do with a mystical connection she had detected once. What intrigued Rose was that despite the deaths she witnessed, nothing was reported in the newspapers or on TV, almost as if they hadn't happened. So, she assumed she wasn't the only one with this energy running through her body. This group or organization was purposely hiding the existence of the monsters. This was something Rose readily agreed to do. Just imagining how much negative emotion would be generated if normal people knew about the existence of the monsters made Rose shiver. It would be a scenario worthy of an apocalyptic movie. As for finding this organization, Rose was in no hurry, especially since she didn't know how they would react to her existence. Prematurely exposing herself wasn't exactly a smart move. Got you. Suddenly, Rose's steps halted. She raised her head and looked at an abandoned building with a malicious smile. She had been hunting this monster for 2 weeks. It was entirely different from the other monsters she had encountered before. This one could move from its origin point and had an absurdly rapid growth rate. Rose knew that if she didn't catch it today, this monster would become a much bigger problem, potentially endangering the entire town. And that wasn't a risk she wanted to leave unchecked. Easily jumping over the metal fence protecting the building, she landed on the other side with her hands in her pockets. Suddenly, she couldn't feel the monster's aura anymore, but that didn't discourage her. On the contrary, the smile on her face grew. Even while camouflaging its own presence, the monster didn't know it left traces of energy wherever it went, so it didn't matter if it hid now. With her hands in her pockets, Rose whistled as she walked toward the building that resembled an abandoned hospital. Let's play a little midline horizontal ellipsis, she thought as she entered the building, her incredibly blue eyes glowing with a phosphorescent shine. With her steps echoing in the empty, dusty corridor, Rose showed no sign of nervousness or fear, only a bored expression. The monster hadn't appeared even after half an hour, but she could feel its gaze. Cruel and hungry. Rose's smile widened as she felt the gaze on her becoming increasingly uncontrollable. In the end, even after gaining wisdom, an animal was still an animal, driven by instinct. Suddenly, Rose jumped into the air and stuck to the ceiling upside down. In the spot where she had been, black spikes made from an unknown liquid emerged from the floor. If she had stayed there, her body would have been pierced numerous times, which definitely wouldn't have been good. You finally decided to show up. Are you ready to die? Rose said, smiling arrogantly. That day, she killed another monster, a very special one though equally as weak as all the others before it and just like the ones to come. Chapter 105 Arrival of Country Representatives 1. When do you return to Hogwarts? This place is so boring without you, Asterion heard Daphne's voice through a mirror on his dresser. In the mirror's reflection, Daphne's image was perfectly clear, her blue eyes fixed on his abdomen, unable to look away for a long time. Putting on his white long-sleeved shirt, Asterion calmly responded to his fiancée, in 2 weeks, I have to deal with some things at the clock tower. He buttoned his shirt without minding Daphne's gaze. Sometimes it was amusing to see the noble and elegant Daphne Greengrass act so pervertedly. Did something important happen? Hearing Asterion mention the clock tower, Daphne reluctantly tore her gaze from her fiancé's abdomen and asked worriedly, looking at him. You should read the newspapers more often, they are important sources of information, Daphne. But to answer your question, the Triwizard Tournament will be held this year along with numerous countries. I was chosen to greet all the representatives from the countries arriving in England, Asterion responded, rolling his eyes at his fiancée. He knew Daphne didn't like reading newspapers much, but he hadn't expected her to be unaware of such an important event. Newspapers are boring, and I have a lot to study. I don't have as much free time as before. The second year is very demanding. I can barely eat without being in a hurry to get to class, Daphne defended herself vehemently, clearly displeased with his words. Asterion didn't respond back, knowing that in a battle of words, he was no match for his fiancée, especially since he was always wrong in her eyes. Woof. 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 Hearing the barks, Daphne's gaze fell on the small puppy that emerged from Asterion's shadow. The puppy had hundreds of eyes, all looking at her with great dissatisfaction, as if it didn't like her words at all. That furry little thing is so protective of you, Asti, Daphne laughed, looking at the adorable dog with amusement. Baskerville's size didn't seem intimidating to her. Asterion also laughed. He had used Baskerville's blood to recreate his faithful companion and had succeeded after using an insane amount of negative magical energy. This time, Baskerville had been recreated using both of Asterion's innate techniques, which made the dog extremely strong with even more insane protective abilities. Although the demon dog was slightly different than before. Don't get it wrong, Baskerville was still as sadistic and cruel as before, but after dying and being recreated, he seemed much smarter than before. Asterion assumed he had infused more negative magical energy than necessary, causing Baskerville to attain the intelligence of a cursed spirit that had departed from its original place. Of course, Baskerville's cute appearance was purely his own choice. For some reason, his cursed spirit found it more intelligent to make his master's enemies lower their guard when they saw how adorable he looked. I have to go, Daphne. Placing the watch on his wrist, Asterion turned to the mirror on the dresser, where Daphne's image was being projected. Remember to call me the night before you go to sleep. Daphne nodded and spoke before ending the magical connection between her mirror and Asterion's. Baskerville emerged from his master's shadow, but his hundreds of eyes still appeared in his shadow. Leaving the room, Asterion found Narcissa waiting for him. She was wearing a long skirt that reached her ankles and a white lace blouse with long sleeves. Her pale blonde hair was styled in an elegant bun. She held an agenda against her belly. The former Lady Malfoy looked like a secretary. Which is exactly what she was at the moment. The secretary of the Lord of the Clock Tower in the 9th Department of Curses, Asterion Black. Narcissa, feeling bored from spending all day at the mansion, had offered to work at the clock tower, an offer Asterion had gladly accepted. The amount of paperwork he had to sign couldn't be described in words. With Narcissa's addition, Asterion practically only needed to sign a few more important documents while the easier ones were handled by Narcissa. At first, he was concerned about the heavy workload, but seeing how diligent and satisfied Narcissa was after starting work, he put those concerns aside. As for Bellatrix, Asterion only knew that she was conducting some experiments in the basement. He didn't ask what experiments they were or why there were screams late at night. As long as it wasn't involving innocents, Asterion was indifferent to Bellatrix's actions. Arcturus was still Arcturus, the man was still alive, although deteriorating every day. Asterion wanted to delay as long as possible before taking the man to the secret room. Who will be the first to arrive? Walking through the mansion's corridors, Asterion asked Narcissa beside him. The current Minister of Magic from France, Louis Delacour, and his family. Narcissa opened her agenda and answered, her high heels skillfully stepping on the floor. Current? Asterion asked, confused. He hadn't paid much attention to France recently, so he was surprised by the new Minister of Magic from France. A month ago, elections were held in France, and the new Minister of Magic was chosen. Narcissa continued, Louis Delacour is a pure-blood wizard very popular in France. He is married to Avila, which has made him highly regarded in the eyes of other races and many French wizards and witches. Asterion was genuinely surprised. He hadn't expected Fleur Delacour's father to be elected as the French Minister of Magic at this delicate moment, which also explained one of the reasons for France's recent desire for reconciliation. Asti, do you want me to fetch an alchemical item that prevents Vila charm affecting your mind? Narcissa asked, furrowing her brow, mindful of the Vila's extraordinary charm. Asterion shook his head and replied indifferently, no need, I can control myself just fine. With Baskerville looming behind him, he felt no fear of any influence, even though Vila charm was renowned for being nearly invincible. By the way, is your cursed spirit going to remain exposed like this? Narcissa asked, pointing at the hundreds of eyes in his cousin's shadow. Honestly, it was a bit unsettling to be stared at by hundreds of wide red eyes. I let him do as he pleases, Asterion shrugged and moved on. Narcissa said nothing more and continued introducing the numerous representatives who had come or would come to England in the near future. As they conversed, both exited the mansion, got into a car, and headed towards the clock tower. Chapter 106 Arrival of Country Representatives, 2. Asterion, Narcissa, and several other senators stood before a large number of fireplaces burning with emerald-green flames. Behind them, a sizable group of journalists awaited the arrival of the French delegation in England. Except for Asterion and Narcissa, whether senators or journalists, everyone displayed quite displeased expressions at the moment. They're nearly half an hour late, grumbled Amelia Bones, a senator of Parliament, as she glanced at her pocket watch. The apparent and quite disrespectful delay of the French delegation left her very upset. Minister Delacour must still be dressing with his half-blood wife, a senator mocked in the background, prompting disdainful laughter from everyone. Clearly, the lineage of the French Minister of Magic's wife was already well known. Perhaps in France, marrying another race was something new and warmly welcomed. But in England, where witches and wizards considered themselves the finest breed in the world, tainting one's blood was definitely frowned upon. Senator Carl Foley, please refrain from any remarks that might affect the image of our beautiful country in front of delegations from other nations. We are not barbarians, Asterion said calmly, looking at the nephew of the neutral faction lord, his voice causing many to lose their smiles and adopt a serious expression. Asterion knew that a man like this had only become a senator of parliament through nepotism, but he didn't say anything against it. Everyone hated nepotism, but when benefiting from it, everyone loved it. If Asterion didn't have talent, he himself would be like Carl Foley, relying on Arcturus' influence to survive in this dirty and crazy world. Lord Black is right, Carl. Don't be rude, we are noble gentlemen, another senator agreed with Asterion's words, smiling quite amiably at him. Carl Foley felt his cheeks heat up under the unkind gazes of his colleagues. With just a simple phrase, Lord Black had made him feel isolated from most people in the moment. But he knew that everyone wanted to earn the favor of the special grade wizard. Traitors, Carl murmured inaudibly. Ignoring the sycophants, Asterion took out a silver pocket watch and opened it. Seeing the time and no sign of the French government's arrival, Asterion began to think that something had gone wrong. Just as he was about to order everyone to step back and inquire if something had happened to the French government, the emerald flames of 10 fireplaces suddenly surged. Countless wizards and witches began to emerge from the flames, elbows close to their bodies. They want to make a grand entrance, Narcissa commented with a touch of sarcasm in her low voice. They're expected to preserve their dignity, even in this tense moment in Europe, Asterion whispered back to Narcissa, his gaze fixed on the man in the center. He wasn't very tall, measuring about 174 centimeters in height, dressed in a very elegant blue suit. His brown hair was perfectly styled to the side, and his blue eyes, coupled with a friendly smile, made him quite handsome. The current French Minister of Magic, Louise Delacour. Beside him stood perhaps the most aesthetically beautiful woman Asterion had ever seen. Her silver hair cascaded like a waterfall of soft silver strands over her shoulders and back. Her eyes were a striking shade of deep gold, almost like pools of melted gold. Her full, sensual lips curved into a smile adorned with a bold shade of red lipstick. Under her hair, she wore a stylish French beret adorned with beautiful flowers. She wore an elegant blue dress matching her husband's, which perfectly accentuated her almost supernatural curves. She was the wife of the French Minister of Magic and a half-Vila, Apollon Delacour. Next to Apollon, there were two young girls, both nearly identical to their mother but lacking her beautiful golden eyes. Instead, they inherited their father's icy, cold blue eyes. Fleur and Gabrielle Delacour. One 17 years old and the other 13, both wore blue dresses and blue berets decorated with butterflies and flowers. "Welcome to England, Minister Delacour," Asterion approached and greeted the French Minister of Magic. "The pleasure is all mine, Monsieur Black." Louise shook Asterion's hand and posed together for a photo, which journalists eagerly snapped. Louise selectively ignored the hundreds of unsettling eyes shadowing Asterion. After the photo, he gestured to the stunning woman beside him and introduced her. "This is my wife, Apollon, and my two daughters, Fleur and Gabrielle." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Monsieur Black." Apollon graciously smiled and extended her hand towards Asterion. Her English was mixed with a lovely French accent, which added to her charm. She glanced at the hundreds of red eyes in Asterion's shadow for a moment, and easily brushed aside the hundreds of unsettling gazes. "Madame Apollon, rumors about your beauty do not do justice to your appearance in person," Asterion said, delicately holding her fingertips and lowering his hand to kiss her knuckles, but without his lips touching her skin. After all, she was a married woman. "Monsieur Black, you are very polite," Apollon replied, withdrawing her hand and letting out a graceful laugh, evidently pleased with the sincere compliment, especially coming from someone not easily enchanted by her charm. The men around couldn't take their eyes off Apollon for a single second since she appeared, including the senators who had previously mocked the French First Lady's lineage. Asterion swore he heard someone gulp behind him. Turning, Asterion looked at the two young women and greeted them even more courteously, "Lady Fleur. It's a pleasure to meet you, Monsieur Black. We've heard many rumors about you." Fleur spoke elegantly, her blue eyes discreetly examining Asterion from head to toe. Asterion merely offered a polite smile and didn't reply. He then turned to the younger of the Delacour sisters and greeted her with elegance, "Lady Gabrielle." The teenager didn't respond, she just stared fixedly at Asterion's face, her cheeks flushing pink, her eyes shining as if she were seeing a pop idol. Fleur had to discreetly elbow her younger sister to snap her out of her stunned state. "Are you all right? Feeling unwell?" Asterion ignored the sister's small actions and asked calmly. "Oh." Gabrielle let out a small surprised gasp, feeling her cheeks burn even more as she realized her behavior, and hurriedly spoke, inventing a rather dubious excuse. "It's all right, I'm just not used to the temperature in England." Her English, mixed with a lovely French accent, which Asterion found quite pleasant to hear. Asterion's lips twitched unnaturally at the overly obvious excuse from the teenager, but he said nothing and turned back to speak with the French Minister of Magic. Fleur looked at her younger sister with an amused look and spoke in French. "It was funny to see you looking at him like a love-struck puppy." Gabrielle widened her eyes and looked angrily at her older sister, speaking with an adorable pout on her lips. "You're mean, sister. Teasing me like this." Fleur covered her mouth with her lace-gloved hand and laughed, narrowing her eyes playfully at her younger sister. "I see my two lovely angels are having fun." Apollon appeared beside her daughters and spoke, laughing graciously. "What do you think of him?" Apollon covered her mouth elegantly and whispered in French. Her eyes fell on Asterion, who was taking photos with the entire French delegation. "He wasn't affected by our charm," Fleur spoke after a brief pause. Apollon agreed with her daughter's words. Asterion truly wasn't swayed by her charm or that of her daughter. Handsome, strong, graceful, perfect. The words poured out of Gabrielle's mouth non-stop, her eyes fixed on Asterion for a long time, leaving Apollon and Fleur speechless. "I know you're infatuated, but be a bit more subtle, Gab. Besides, he's engaged." "Papa wouldn't want a scandal at this moment." Fleur looked at her sister and spoke with concern. Gabrielle's cheeks reddened at her sister's words, and reluctantly she tore her gaze away from her crush. Hearing that Asterion was engaged made a cold, piercing look reflect in her eyes. "Not for long. I doubt Daphne Greengrass is as beautiful as me," she murmured to herself, her eyes returning to focus on Asterion conversing with her father. "Oh my God, they grow up so fast." Apollon sighed tiredly, but the amused smile on her lips didn't disappear for a second. As for Asterion, he did catch her attention, especially because there was no contempt or disgust like with other British wizards she was feeling at the moment. Although lust was evident in every man's gaze, they still despised her, a half-blood. She sensually licked her lips, looking at that perfect face of the young man. It was truly rare to see such a young, handsome, and powerful man. Even Apollon herself was tempted. Chapter 107 Arrival of Country Representatives. 3. What do you think of the actions of Grindelwald's acolytes in Europe, Monsieur Black? Asked Louis, looking at the young man beside him. His smile remained unchanged, even in the face of numerous glances. Louis knew it wouldn't be easy to achieve what he wanted in Britain, especially while still cleaning up the mess left by his predecessor, nearly destroying the France-England relationship. Yet, he needed to try, not just to stay in power, but also to help his country. Truly a tragedy what happened. So many wizards and witches lost their lives in the attacks. Asterion responded with a heavy expression and a dignified, sincere tone. Inside, he thanked Grindelwald. If not for his timely attack, all European countries would be focused on England, which was recovering from the Civil War. It was a great opportunity to strengthen themselves at this moment, with the world's eyes on Europe. England wouldn't be sabotaged because European countries needed help, especially with Dumbledore being the only known man capable of fighting the powerful Dark Lord, Gellert Grindelwald. Louis nodded and smiled, but he didn't believe Asterion's words one bit, knowing the English's hatred of France, especially after this civil war the English and French have entered into that Voldemort began. Not that France didn't harbor hatred towards England. The 100 Years' War had been a deep wound to France's pride, considering itself one of the oldest countries in the world. Both had reasons to love and hate each other. As they conversed, the emerald flames from the fireplaces suddenly grew taller, and from them emerged several male wizards dressed in winter clothes. Among them, one man stood out. Standing 2 meters tall, he resembled a bear in his winter attire. His medium-length, curly black hair fell over his shoulders, and a long beard surrounded his face. He had a serious and cold expression, topped with a traditional Russian hat. This man was Dmitry Ivanov, the Minister of Magic of Russia, one of the 2 special grade wizards in Russia. Spotting Asterion and Louis, he walked over to them and spoke in English with a strong Russian accent. "It seems I am the second to arrive," he said, and Asterion had to concentrate hard, otherwise, he wouldn't understand what Ivanov was saying. "Minister Ivanov." Asterion extended his hand and greeted the powerful special grade wizard. "Nias Black." The Russian minister firmly shook Asterion's hand and returned the greeting. His gaze was respectful, mirroring the respect Asterion showed towards him. The Russian minister valued strength and recognized the young man's prowess before him. But looking towards the French Minister of Magic, Ivanov glanced disdainfully from head to toe but still extended his hand to him. Louis's smile remained unchanged as he greeted the Russian minister with great politeness, maintaining his prestige. This surprised Asterion. He had expected there to be an exchange of insults, especially from Louis. After all, if the 100 Years' War had been a deep wound to French pride. The Napoleonic Wars nearly extinguished France's arrogance. The loss of over 500,000 soldiers on Russian soil prevented France from ever fully recovering its former glory. After the greetings, the three began taking photos together, each shaking hands. They all displayed smiles for the cameras while likely hiding their true thoughts at that moment. Fake smiles and nothing more. "Politics truly is interesting," Apollon commented beside Narcissa, who selectively ignored the overly charming woman. "But I love politics. Power means having more freedom than anyone else, and that's fascinating," Apollon continued, ignoring Narcissa's increasingly cold demeanor. "If you want to talk, just talk, Madame Delacour," Narcissa turned and spoke with a chilly tone. She didn't get along well with people like Apollon, who spoke every second and exuded charisma. Apollon wasn't offended by the woman's cold words. On the contrary, she smiled graciously and linked arms with Narcissa. "We'll go shopping once this ceremony is over." "I won't take no for an answer," Apollon said with a very serious yet charming tone before Narcissa could object. Narcissa couldn't help but look to Asterion for help, but her cousin was engrossed, focusing only on the French and Russian ministers of magic. Grimacing, Narcissa nodded stiffly, causing Apollon to laugh even more. With the arrival of the Russian delegation, representatives from other European countries began to appear one after another. Minister of Magic for Austria, Helena von Strauss. Minister of Magic for Germany, Joseph Weiss. Minister of Magic for Italy, Valentino Ricci. Minister of Magic for Greece, Nicholas Papadopoulos. Minister of Magic for Sweden, Ingrid Bergström. Minister of Magic for Spain, Alejandro Dominguez. Representing the American continents were, President of Macusa, Benjamin Thorne. Minister of Magic for Brazil, Carlos de Silva Pereira. And finally, the two representatives from Asia, Minister of Magic for Japan, Satoshi Nakamura. Minister of Magic for China, Mei Ling Zhao. It was a total of 12 countries that accepted the proposal for an international magic and wizardry tournament in England. Among the 12 ministers, presidents, and Asterion, more than half were special grade wizards. This meant that there were 7 special grade wizards present at that moment. Excluding the special conference in Geneva, where all special grade wizards gathered every 4 years, this was the largest event where special grade wizards were assembled in one place. Asterion lost count of how many photos he took that afternoon. There were so many that his eyes began to ache by the end of the day. His smile was rigid on his lips, and he vowed that he would rarely smile from that day forward. At the same time, his gaze fell upon the French and German ministers of magic, both conversing amiably. This caused Asterion's eyes to narrow dangerously for a moment. It wasn't a good sign in Asterion's eyes. Despite France and Germany having their differences and deep hatred stemming from the events of World War II, the Black Heir did not doubt for a moment that these two countries could ally themselves in a time of need. After all, interests alone are eternal. In the meantime, Asterion also observed the other representatives and quickly realized that the entire ceremony was divided into very distinct blocks. Japan and China, in particular, did not seem eager to initiate a conversation with each other. Asterion understood this well. After all, China harbored deep resentment towards Japan for the war crimes committed during World War II on Chinese soil. These two countries were the only ones Asterion saw no possibility of allying, which naturally suited him. As for the rest of the countries, he was conflicted about which to ally with, but he left that decision to the more experienced individuals at the moment. Chapter 108, Party 1. Looking at the extremely luxurious party happening at the moment, Asterion couldn't help but think that these people were dancing and eating cake while their countries were burning. It was ironic, given that they were elected to represent the rights of the population. Bringing the champagne glass to his lips, he tilted it back, drinking the beverage in one go. The alcohol, as always, had no effect on him, it only served as a simple relaxation. "We meet again, Lord Black." Hearing the clamorous and graceful voice beside him, Asterion turned to see the French First Lady approaching. From the little time he had spent with the woman, he already had an idea of her personality and character. Apollon Delacour was a woman with an almost insatiable hunger for power. But he didn't dislike such people. After all, ambition was never a bad thing, regardless of one's ideals. The desire to be something more was shared by all humanity. Madame Delacour. Despite what he was thinking, Asterion greeted the woman with all possible courtesy. Coming dangerously close to Asterion, Apollon smiled gracefully at the renowned British special-grade wizard. Being a half-Vela, she could sense the colossal amount of magical energy simmering beneath that perfect body. Even standing there, in a discreet corner of the party, he was still the center of everyone's attention. No one could ignore him, almost like a sun making everyone gravitate around him. And as a half-Vela, a race that fed on the magic of their partner to strengthen themselves, Asterion was like an unbelievably delicious cake to Apollon. She couldn't control herself very well around him, which was usually the opposite. It was men who couldn't control themselves around her. And that was because she was a half-Vela. If it were her mother, a full-blooded Vela, she would probably have jumped on him a long time ago. Ignoring the almost hungry look of the married woman, Asterion suddenly asked a question, surprising Apollon. "In your eyes, as a half-Vela, how do you see the world?" His calm voice reached her ears, and his eyes, the most beautiful she had ever seen, looked directly at her. Apollon was stunned for a moment. She never imagined she would hear such a question from anyone, especially from a wizard, particularly one so extremely powerful. Hesitating for the first time, Apollon looked directly into those red eyes and replied sincerely, with a touch of self-deprecation. "A cold and cruel world. Although I am half-human, no one really sees me as human. I am just a half-breed in the eyes of all the wizards and witches in the world." "Do you see yourself as human?" Asterion asked again, once more leaving Apollon stunned by the nature of the question. "Yes." After a brief pause, Apollon responded firmly. "If you believe that, then you are human. You don't need anyone saying otherwise. Caring about what others say makes you weak and vulnerable." Asterion spoke, his voice calm and even indifferent, yet for some reason, it made Apollon bite her lips, looking at him with a very complex expression. "Why am I not 20 years younger?" Midline horizontal ellipsis, Apollon murmured to herself, looking at the young man with a touch of passion growing in her eyes. Now she understood her youngest daughter, Gabrielle. It wasn't just the magical energy attracting her, but his character and personality were equally unique. Seeing the increasingly heated gaze of the married woman, Asterion's lips twitched abnormally. He had just stated the obvious and didn't understand why she was looking at him like a lovesick maiden. Your husband doesn't seem to mind you being surrounded by other men. Asterion skillfully changed the subject, feeling that the atmosphere around him was becoming increasingly ambiguous, especially the expression on the French First Lady's face. It was not an expression a married woman should show another man. Placing a gloved hand on his arm, Apollon laughed gracefully and responded with a subtle flirt. We have a rather open relationship. French. Asterion couldn't help but snort, understanding the essence of the relationship between the French Minister of Magic and his wife. Apollon merely laughed at Asterion's snort, finding it incredibly cute that he reacted that way. Suddenly, Apollon noticed the Russian Minister of Magic, Dmitry Ivanov, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. I won't bother you any longer, Lord Black. As a mature woman, Apollon almost immediately understood what was happening and bid farewell with an elegant smile, leaving with a deliberate sway of her hips. She laughed over her shoulder, seeing Asterion's gaze on her backside. Letting out a relieved sigh, Asterion couldn't help but curse how beautiful Apollon was. Even with Baskerville, he was still subtly fascinated by the charm of the half-villa. Niaz Black. Ivanov greeted Asterion and handed him a glass of champagne. Asterion didn't mind Ivanov's use of the High Russian noble term. In a sense, he was indeed a prince. Minister Ivanov. Asterion politely greeted the Russian Minister of Magic in return. Although Ivanov appeared to be a large and brainless individual, the Black Heir knew that to remain at the top of the snake pit that was Russia, brute strength alone wouldn't suffice for Ivanov to survive in that cold country. At the same time, Asterion could feel discreet glances falling upon him and the Russian Minister of Magic. I'll be direct, Niaz Black, Ivanov said, his tone serious and formal. I believe that an alliance between our countries is in our mutual interests. The words of the Russian Minister of Magic truly surprised Asterion. He blinked a few times, trying to understand if he had heard the Russian Minister of Magic correctly. Asterion's brain was working at full speed, trying to comprehend the consequences of such actions at such a public event. You are indeed direct, Minister Ivanov. As Asterion was about to respond, he heard the voice of another man approaching. Seeing who had arrived, Ivanov's face darkened almost instantly. Benjamin Thorne, President of Makusa. Looking at both special-grade wizards, Asterion felt like a puzzle had been completed in his mind. Russia and the United States. After the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, present-day Russia was now more fragmented than ever and without allies, especially in Europe, where everyone hated the socialist regime. The United States naturally didn't want its old mortal enemy to recover so quickly and ally with England. Still, Asterion was curious. The United States was currently recovering from the Cold War and the Persian Gulf War. If another war happened, the people would definitely be furious with the state. I don't think it's any of your business, Benjamin. The Russian minister spoke rudely, not bothering to show a bit of respect for the Makusa leader. Still holding a grudge about our fight, Ivanov? The Makusa president's smile remained unchanged in the face of the Russian minister's words. Grudge? You should be the one holding a grudge. After all, your wife certainly remembers me. Since you couldn't satisfy her. Ivanov spoke with a sarcastic smile, his voice intentionally loud, making sure everyone heard his words very clearly. The smile on Benjamin's face disappeared at his old rival's words. Ex-wife, and you were a coward for going after my wife. With the words of the Makusa president, a tense atmosphere began to settle over the party hall. The other ministers of magic from other countries watched the show with smiles, interested in the argument between the two special grade wizards. Chapter 109, Party 2. This is good, Apollon heard her husband whisper as he watched the argument between the two powerful countries. She understood her husband's mentality. If Russia allied with England, the United States would ally with France. This had always been the global scenario the United States wanted in Europe, with both sides maintaining a certain balance in case of war, and Louis deeply agreed with this. As long as France was safe from any future attack by Grindelwald, Louis was even willing to ally with their former enemies, England. Only Louis knew how stressful it was to be the French Minister of Magic. His people were the most protest-prone in the world, and his presidential throne seemed like a throne of dynamite ready to explode at the slightest mistake. Next to Louis, Apollon couldn't help but remember the events that forced this party to take place in the first place, Gellert Grindelwald, the powerful seer and Dark Lord. But looking at what was happening now, everyone had forgotten about Grindelwald and were focusing on securing allies. It was almost as if a war was about to break out at any moment. Minister Ivanov, President Benjamin, I don't think this is the place for a discussion of your caliber. Seeing the magical auras of the two special grade wizards begin to manifest, making the air heavier and the weaker guests pale, Asterion decided to intervene by manifesting his own aura. After all, if a fight broke out, it would be a slap in the face to the host of the party, which meant a slap in the face to him. A tremendous amount of magical energy spread throughout the surroundings. All the special grade wizards and witches present instantly focused on Asterion, all with complex expressions. The absurd amount of magical energy they were feeling almost made their eyes widen in shock. Even veterans like Ivanov and Benjamin focused on Asterion, their eyes becoming more serious and respectful. In the end, strength was still the oldest and strongest form of dialogue in humanity. With the accidental display of strength by the three countries, England, Russia, and the United States, the entire party was almost instantly reorganized. The only country left out was Brazil, which was to be expected for a generally neutral country. After all, if you don't attack me, I won't attack you. The country had only come to participate in the international tournament of magic and wizardry. You're lucky we're in England, Benjamin. Seeing the countries conversing among themselves, Ivanov couldn't help but curl his lips in a satisfied smile. I would say that you're the lucky one, Dmitri. Benjamin also smiled satisfactorily and countered his old rival's words with the same intensity. The two stared at each other with intensity, but their smiles indicated they were both very happy at that moment. Asterion looked at both with a calm gaze and couldn't help but curse how cunning these two old foxes were. He finally realized their plans. But in the end, he said nothing and remained silent, as their strategy indirectly helped England. Especially seeing the Japanese minister approaching him. Asterion-sama. Satoshi Nakamura, the Japanese minister of magic, greeted politely, bowing to Asterion. Nakamura-sama. Asterion returned the greeting with a smile. Japan was an important ally in case a war broke out. As Japan approached, Spain and Sweden also drew closer. Italy, which Asterion thought wouldn't come after the events of the Seven Powers War, unexpectedly approached him as well. But he soon understood the Italian Minister of Magic's reasoning. There were no special grade wizards in Italy at the moment, which meant the whole country was weak compared to the surrounding nations, and this was extremely concerning when it came to commercial interests and protection. Although it was impossible to form an alliance with these countries with just one conversation, everything starts with a conversation. At least, the first step was taken. That was intense. Fleur commented, using her hand to fan herself, a rosy color staining her cheeks as she watched all the governments conversing among themselves. The magical energy in the air seemed so delicious to her. The 17-year-old's blue eyes fell on Asterion. Being 1/4 Vela, Fleur didn't need to absorb magical energy like her mother, but she could still feel how delicious it would be to absorb Asterion's magical energy. Fufufu. Apollon, next to her daughter, just laughed and looked at Asterion with a gaze a bit warmer than before. Then, her gaze fell on her younger daughter, and seeing Gabrielle's eyes glued to Asterion, Apollon couldn't help but tease her. "Dear, if you keep looking at him so intently, he'll evaporate from the earth." Gabrielle rolled her eyes at her mother and didn't care about the teasing. In her eyes, there was only Asterion and no one else. Classical music began to play, and everyone found their partners and started dancing in the center of the hall. Seeing Asterion's tired face, Narcissa couldn't help but approach and offer a glass of chilled champagne. "Thank you, Sissy." Asterion took the glass and drank, moistening his dry throat from all the talking. He never thought a conversation could be so difficult, especially when it involved other countries. "How is it going?" Narcissa asked, looking at everyone dancing in the center of the hall. "It's going well, especially with Russia, but if we ally with Russia, the United States will become our enemy." Asterion spoke in a tired tone, weary of the constant conflicts between the two countries. If he allied with one, the other would automatically become his enemy. It was exhausting, both countries seemed like children fighting over a toy. "Let's talk while we dance," Asterion said, extending his hand, which Narcissa took with a smile, and both went to the dance floor. Holding Narcissa's waist, Asterion pulled her close, and they began to dance. "What do you think of France?" Asterion whispered, tightening his grip on Narcissa's waist as they twirled, passing by other couples dancing in the center of the hall. "The French Minister of Magic seems too naive, especially seeking an alliance with Germany. The French will hate allying with those who invaded and occupied them." Narcissa leaned closer to Asterion's ear and whispered back, glancing at the French couple who were the center of attention. Asterion nodded but didn't completely agree with Narcissa's words. The man was naive in certain matters, but he was still a politician who had reached the position of Minister of Magic, the pinnacle of power in an entire country. He didn't think Louis was foolish, especially with his political career at stake. On second thought, France and Germany allied could make many countries' nerves tense. If someone adds a bit of fuel and lights a match, maybe the Third World War will start. Asterion spoke with a calm and profound look as his steps synchronized with Narcissa's. Narcissa showed a worried expression and nodded, focusing on the dance, though the concern on her face did not disappear. "Don't worry, Sissy. Even if a war begins, I will protect you and all of England," Asterion said after seeing the worry on his cousin's face. "I know, I'm just concerned about another war. If it happens, it will be the third in less than 2 decades. I'm tired of all these deaths." Leaning on his shoulder, Narcissa spoke with a melancholic tone. Asterion remained silent, and both continued to dance among many other couples to the gentle classical music. Chapter 110 Back to Hogwarts. 1. After a long day at the clock tower, Asterion returned to the Black Mansion. Almost all the matters concerning the International Tournament of Magic and Witchcraft were resolved, and everything was ready to begin. All the nations that had come to England agreed to participate in the event. The only thing left was to prepare the venue for the tournament. This was excellent news. The International Tournament of Magic and Witchcraft was a perfect event to showcase the superiority of the clock tower to the citizens, demonstrating that they were fit to replace the old Ministry of Magic. Walking through the mansion's corridors, only Asterion's footsteps echoed in the air. His red eyes seemed to glow, and a black pentagram revealed itself in his eyes. Upon reaching the entrance hall, Asterion's red eyes fell upon the statue of his ancestor, Corvinus Black. The ruby eyes of the statue seemed to look down on him, as if evaluating something. Nothing more fitting than using the cursed spirit that started it all, Asterion murmured, looking at the statue, his gaze full of expectation. He was ready to carry out the millennia-old plan of his ancestors, or at least, a prototype of it. Creating a god directly was impossible, but the first step was about to be realized, something his ancestors never managed to achieve. The innate Slytherin house technique was essential for making something like this possible. The imperfect destruction of truth, it greatly helped Asterion process the insane amounts of information. After all, a melody signifying omnipotence and omniscience was not something he could conceive on his own. But, looking at the statue before him, Asterion felt something disturbing. Sealed inside the statue was a cursed spirit so powerful that he wondered how much hatred and resentment Corvinus must have felt to unconsciously transform his own sister into a cursed spirit. Asterion had tried to find records about Corvinus's sister, but the man had intentionally erased them all. If it weren't for Herpo, whom he presumed was using Mustafa's body, he would never have thought that this cursed spirit was also his ancestor. Touching the cold body of the statue, Asterion felt a chill run down his spine. He could hear a faint, powerful heartbeat, which in itself showed how special the sealed cursed spirit was. In his shadow, Asterion could hear the calls of Baskerville, urging him to stay away from it, warning that there was something very dangerous within the statue. This made Asterion's lips curl into a satisfied smile, the more powerful the cursed spirit, the easier it would be to execute his house's ancestral plan. The world no longer needed cursed spirits, and it was time for them to cease to exist. "Master, what are you doing?" Asterion heard Bellatrix's voice behind him. Turning around, he couldn't help but curl his lips abnormally while observing his cousin. Bellatrix was covered in blood from head to toe, her green eyes looking especially malevolent at that moment. In her hands was a naked, bloodied man whom she was dragging by the hair. The poor wretch was pleading with his eyes for death, something Asterion chose to ignore. The man Bellatrix was torturing was no saint, on the contrary, he was the highest level of human scum, a serial rapist. "Nothing, just thinking about our ancestor," Asterion replied to Bellatrix's question, walking towards her and wiping a splatter of blood from her cheek. "He must have been crazy. Look at how our family is." Bellatrix narrowed her eyes, very pleased with his act of wiping the blood, and replied cheerfully, her voice so happy it didn't seem like she had been torturing someone moments ago. At that moment, the man she was holding by the hair thrashed violently upon hearing her cheerful tone, as if to say otherwise, which made Bellatrix's face change from happy to a terrifying look in less than a second. "Move again and I'll make you swallow your own dick, muggle scum," she said cruelly, with sadism in her voice, and kicked his body violently with her high heel. Watching Bellatrix act like herself made Asterion roll his eyes at the hypocrisy of her words and actions. Calling someone crazy while being crazy was indeed very credible. "But, master, you lie very badly," said Bellatrix, stopping her kicking and smiling innocently. She looked at Asterion with her enigmatic green eyes. Facing those green eyes, Asterion remained silent and just shrugged. He walked towards his room. Seeing Asterion walking to his room, Bellatrix's eyes lit up. But before she could be happy, Asterion's voice reached her ears. "My door will be locked, Bellatrix." The happy look turned into sadness, almost like a puppy abandoned by its owner. Then Bellatrix's eyes met those of her victim. "Since I can't have a pleasurable night, you'll have a very painful one," she whispered, dragging the man by the hair to her private basement, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Hogwarts watching the visibly more excited students passing by her, Rose showed a satisfied smile. She preferred the school atmosphere this way rather than the palpable tension left by the attack. Everyone seemed eager about the upcoming International Tournament of Magic and Witchcraft, which would be hosted at Hogwarts. Today was also a special day. Asterion would be returning to Hogwarts after long months of only seeing him through a page in a magical newspaper. Trying to change that indifferent expression of his had almost become a ritual for her. Although he had been somewhat distant since she began training with Dumbledore, Rose didn't think something like that would drive her cousin away from her. After all, she wasn't his enemy. Humming, Rose walked, feeling the changes after her enlightenment, as she called it. After having her body almost stolen by Voldemort, for the first time in her life, she felt an extremely fatal danger. The fear and terror she experienced were unlike anything she had ever felt before. For the first time in her life, she felt she was no longer invincible. But during such a fatal situation, she finally discovered the missing number in her final equation, a small number that did things in her mind she had never imagined. The sensation of euphoria and the ecstasy of having the whole universe at her fingertips made her seem like a lunatic. Fortunately, after some time adapting to her enlightenment, the adrenaline in her body calmed down, and she returned to being a normal person, able to smile without seeming crazy or anything like that. Entering the Gryffindor common room, Rose spotted her best friend Hermione reading quietly. If there was anyone who loved knowledge as much as she did, it was the girl with brown hair. Although, perhaps it had something to do with Hermione's innate technique. Lying on the couch with her head resting on her friend's soft and comfortable thighs, Rose looked up at her, smiling. "You seem excited." Ignoring Rose on her thighs, Hermione spoke distractedly, turning the page, her brown eyes focused on every line written in the book. "Asterion is coming back to Hogwarts, Mione." Rose replied nonchalantly, her red lips curving into a very beautiful smile. Just imagining reuniting with him after a few months apart made her very happy. She would enjoy every minute trying to change that indifferent expression on his face. Hermione blinked a few times upon hearing the news and finally took her focus off the book in her hands. The brown-haired girl couldn't help but look at her friend with a peculiar expression. "Is there something strange on my face?" Seeing the strange look on Hermione's face, Rose asked, confused, touching her face in search of something unusual. "You don't realize?" Hermione was speechless at her best friend's innocent reaction. "Realize what?" Rose asked, even more confused. "Nothing." Hermione rolled her eyes and said nothing about the obvious passion her friend felt for Asterion. Probably even a blind person could see that Rose was too happy about Asterion's arrival. Strange. Rose looked at Hermione with a puzzled expression but didn't ask further and relaxed on her thighs while humming a soft melody. Hermione just rolled her eyes again, thinking her friend was really in love and hadn't even realized it. Though she didn't think this passion would go far in the first place, not when Asterion had a fiancé who obviously liked him a lot. Next chapter, second volume, Chapter 111, Back to Hogwarts, 2, Chapter 112, New Students, 1, Chapter 113, New Students, 2, Chapter 114, Ophelia, 1, Chapter 115, Ophelia, 2, Chapter 116, Doubts, 1, Chapter 117, Humbug, 1, Chapter 118, Ophelia's Mother, 1, Chapter 119, I Decided to Seduce Daphne, 1, Chapter 120, Arrival of the 12 Schools of Witchcraft and Wizardry, 1, Chapter 121, Arrival of the 12 Schools of Witchcraft and Wizardry, 2. Chapter 122, Arrival of the 12 Schools of Witchcraft and Wizardry, 3, Chapter 123, Arrival of the 12 Schools of Witchcraft and Wizardry, 4, Chapter 124, Conspiracy in Progress, 1. Chapter 125 Conspiracy in Progress. 2. Chapter 126 Ophelia, Narcissa, and Andromeda. 1. Chapter 127 Ophelia, Narcissa, and Andromeda. 2. Chapter 128 The Four Representatives of Hogwarts. 1. Chapter 129 The Four Representatives of Hogwarts. 2.